Welcome to Proles of the Round Table.
Hello and welcome to Proles of the Round Table, where we sit down, have a few drinks, and talk Marxist history. Check out our website at prolespod.com, where you can find our back catalog, links to all the resources we talk about, and a whole communist ebook library, along with a few recipes. If you want to extra support us, check out our Patreon, where you can give your hard-earned wages to a bunch of tankies in exchange for bonus episodes, clothes, and content. Find out more at patreon.com/prolespod. We wanted to thank this episode's primary sponsor, who enabled us to buy branded merchandise and sell them, thereby turning ourselves into petty bourgeois in the literal sense. Big thanks to our sponsor, Central Azucarera de Tarlac. Also, to stop the angry treats, we don't actually do that. We don't buy goods and then resell them. That's not a thing that we do. So today with us, we have Daniel. Thank you so much for coming on. How are you doing?
I'm all right. I was just nearby Colorado Springs for some union stuff with the Teamsters Union. So I decided to swing on down and talk to y'all.
Kind of an impromptu thing.
Yeah.
So some of what you do is, let's say, not necessarily above board, strictly speaking. So we're trying to keep it in vague terms, in terms of like your bio and who you are and whatnot.
Don't want my company to get mad at me.
Right. So I guess, what do you want to say about yourself in terms of your background and your connection to, I guess, what is the topic you're going to be discussing today?
So we're going to talk about the Philippine Revolution, some of its history, as well as some of the current trends that's going on. The People's Democratic Revolution of the Philippines, or how some of us say the National Democratic Revolution with the socialist perspective. And it encompasses various, like legal organizations and activities. So we have members in the Philippine House of Representatives. I think we have like 6 or 7 members of the House of Representatives representing progressive teachers, progressive students and youth, and of course, workers and peasants, and also either 1 or 2 people from Gabriela Women's Party List, representing women's issues in the Philippines. And then also includes like extra legal, I guess is what folks would say,
sure.
Activities. So very assertive protests or very assertive planned riots, I guess, especially in the urban poor, when they have to beat back basically the cops from demolishing their homes,
right?
Especially in the urban centers. And then you also have the underground movement, which is being led by the Communist Party of the Philippines, which was refounded in 1968. And then there's also the National Democratic Front of the Philippines, which is like the most consolidated revolutionary core of revolutionary underground organizations that support the armed struggle, and also follows the leadership of the party. And then, of course, you have the armed struggle, or the New People's Army. So it encompasses this like broad
huge thing,
huge millions and millions of people. So talk a little bit about that, a little bit of the history of the party, mostly because you guys are very like prolet focused. So I'll be maybe talking a little bit more history about the party. And then maybe just a broad overview of the Philippine Revolution. And then hopefully, I was talking to some of my friends in Manila, like you'll get 1 or 2 of them to also talk about the more contemporary issues under the U.S. Duterte regime, is what we say, or the U.S. Duterte fascist dictatorship, especially with the whole of the nation approach, quote unquote, with their counterinsurgency, where they're now trying to blur the lines between legal national democratic organizations, which are in the legal realm, and there's nothing illegal with being a national democrat or even having a socialist perspective in the Philippines. But of course, it's very dangerous because the government's overrun by comprador and landlord folks. So hopefully you'll get more of that perspective as well. So a little bit about myself. Grew up on the West Coast, working class family. I'm a worker myself. I have an industrial job. I'm a shop steward in my union, Teamsters. and grew up in like pretty much a working class neighborhood with a lot of Filipino, Chinese, and Irish folks. And then started organizing in the National Democratic Movement in my city like 15 years ago. So I was about 18 or 19 when I started, and started out with youth organizing, but I was still a worker. Currently, the job I have now as a truck driver, I had back then, even as a youth. And before that, I was a janitor. And like, you know, for many, many years, I've been organizing with Filipino working class folks who are either migrants from the Philippines or people who are born here and are also workers as well. So I do a lot of organizing along those lines. And of course, there's the connection back to the Philippines as well, obviously, because it's a semi-feudal, semi-colonial nation, and the government literally has administrations to send people overseas because they're able to tax their remittances and they're able to tax them leaving, and they have to pay fees to leave, and they have to pay recruiter fees just to get recruited to go to places like Hong Kong and get treated by shit by the bourgeois in Hong Kong or Saudi Arabia. And even the United States, there's also overseas contract workers, but many of the migrants in the United States didn't come as overseas contract workers. They came as petty bourgeois in the Philippines because there's no jobs for them or for their skills, and they came to the U.S., and many of them just ended up becoming workers themselves anyway. So nurses became care home takers or caregivers, and people who were maybe office workers became workers at Subway sandwiches or 7-Eleven. So a lot of the people I work with are like either service sector workers or like industrial workers and drivers like myself.
Nice.
So, yeah.
Cool.
So kind of a long intro. My bad.
That's all right. And so also with us today, we have...
Hi. It's Alex.
It's me, Alex.
Today, I just had bourgeoisie tears and coffee. Trying to be healthy. I was really sick.
And 8 Hop. I'm drinking Rider's Tears whiskey.
And this is Jeremy, and I am drinking Red Baron Oktoberfest from Bristol Brewing. It's fine.
It's fine.
It's not the greatest. I've never had it before, and I was like, hey, sure.
I second that notion.
Yeah,
it's fine.
It's fine.
It's not like Budweiser. You know?
Sure. Yeah.
Even though they're Teamsters and I should support them and I should buy Budweiser, but it's not good.
You know who defends Bud Light is Senior Taylor. He
no.
Yeah, he
What?
does. He said that there's a beer for all occasions, and Bud Light is one of his favorites. And I'm like, that's so weird because he's such a snob about beer.
Oh my God.
Anyway. Yeah, so I guess where would you like to begin, Daniel?
Oh God. Most of the stuff I'm going to go over, and I'll even give you links and stuff for your show notes. A lot of it comes from Philippine Society and Revolution. There's even this good book. It's an interview of the founder of the Communist Party, Jose Maria Sison, who's like basically enforced exile in the Netherlands with other refugees from Bangladesh, some from Nepal, and a lot from the Philippines.
Oh yeah, you were telling me that like in like Philippine propaganda, they say that he lives in like a mansion or something in the Netherlands.
He lives in a mansion.
Yeah.
Like somehow the revolutionary movement funnels all these precious resources and money that the revolutionary movement needs.
Yeah.
To the Netherlands
so
to,
he can
to
live
give
in
him a mansion. But there's this really good movie called The Gorilla is a Poet, which is based off of one of his poems because like Mao, he was a poet. Very good poet. He would criticize most of his poetry as bourgeois. But it was good poetry and he still does it. But the movie is there's actors who play him and his wife and the other founders of the Communist Party and the New People's Army. But then they also interview him and Julieta de Lima and Cadante and other folks. So they like splice in the interviews, and the interviews, they're interviewing them in their apartment. And it's like you could very clearly see it's not, but maybe that's also propaganda. And
Right.
Just been brainwashed.
It's sort of like when you tell people that Stalin lived in an apartment that he shared with Molotov, and people are like, bullshit, he did. Bro.
Yeah.
Propaganda is strong.
So a lot of it will come from that, as well as just from some other sources, and just like off, like just from being in the movement for a long time, and
Sure.
just talking to people.
Yeah, personal experience.
But I'll base it mostly off of the Philippine Society and Revolution, which is a political text. It's the political program that Jose Maria Sison wrote as Amado Guerrero. He didn't just write it. There was other people in the Central Committee. And it's basically their political program. So it goes over like the history of the Philippines and how it became semi-feudal, semi-colonial. And then it goes over like the 3 basic problems of the Philippines, which is feudalism, bureaucrat capitalism, and of course, number 1, U.S. imperialism. You know, they also have to contend with Japan and like South Korea, but number 1, U.S. imperialists. Yeah. Number 1 terrorists is a chant you'll hear a lot in the Philippines.
Yeah.
U.S. imperialists, number 1 terrorist. And then chapter 3, it's just 3. It's a very simple book. People read it. They're like, oh, that wasn't like sourced, or that like, this isn't 500 pages. I'm like, yeah, thank God. Cause like, we have to organize workers and peasants around this movement. So, and then the 3rd chapter is solutions, which is basically the People's Democratic Revolution. So I'll sort of base the history off of that. So like there was like history in the Philippines, like before Spanish colonialism and after. And then I'm going to try to quickly go through it, but you guys can interrupt me and ask questions or whatever.
Yeah, sure,
but,
sure.
You know, like,
and this is, like you were saying, we're going to do our best to contact some people who are currently in the Philippines to do some, remote call in sort of things. So this will be a little bit different format than I think we're usually used to, with one guest talking on one topic.
Yeah, that would be my recommendation. And then just so we could split it up and it's not like tons and tons of just information. And, one important thing about the revolution that I can't stress enough is cultural work and like music. So I'll after this, I'll give you guys a bunch of music and maybe I can help you edit, just be like splicing music here. Because like it's the most, it's so important to the revolutionary movement. It's unbelievable. Like every activist in the Philippines has a guitar. And I even show you that documentary, about these Communist Party underground members, and they were youth. They were like 18 and they were like practicing just songs, and the songs are like beautiful songs, but they're like Marxist songs.
It's funny because this one dude was like, no, hang on, that's supposed to be an F sharp, and he just takes the guitar away from the dude and like plays it. It's funny. It's really fun.
That's amazing.
But yeah, so basic history, like the Philippines before was not the Philippines, right? Of course, there was trade in between the islands. There's Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. So Luzon, like fairly large island in the north, Mindanao, fairly large island in the south, and the Visayas are the central islands, and they're also big. But of course, there's over like 1,100 islands or whatever, depending on the tide, is what people say.
And it's not like there was not like a single society which stretched across all of these.
There was not.
Like
they were all in mostly contact with each other through trade, but there was no single like I'm Filipino. Like there wasn't that. There was
no identity of that.
Very advanced barangay systems in parts of Luzon and especially the Visayas. Kind of semi-slave, semi-communal, slave, not like American slave, like very different, like Southeast Asian context from like thousands of years ago.
Yeah, and that's something that's important to sort of denote, like when people are like, oh, well, there's been slavery in Africa long before.
This thing.
It's a
very
totally different context.
Yeah.
It was generally like we captured your village and you are our slaves. But
and then maybe eventually you free yourself, or you have your own slaves,
or you have negotiation among other people, and you're like, okay, well, we captured your people here, and you captured our people here, so we're going to exchange it. It's not like slavery in the U.S.
Not chattel slavery,
not chattel slavery, not
capitalism.
Generational slavery.
Right.
No.
Yeah. So there was that. Some communal folks like the Aitas or the Igorot in the north. But the most quote unquote advanced system in the terms of politically, it was very unified, was in Mindanao with Bangsamoro. It was a feudal system. And the Bangsamoro people are a national minority fighting for national autonomy or even independence right now, which is something that the Communist Party of the Philippines and the Revolution movement recognizes, because there's very distinct national characteristics of the Bangsamoro people, like culturally, religiously.
But you said they're not indigenous to the Philippines, correct?
They're not necessarily indigenous like the way the Lumad people are like indigenous, or the Aita people are indigenous, because there was all this trade between the Islamic world from Saudi Arabia, India, Indonesia. So there's like a mixture of different cultures and stuff in the Bangsamoro people. But it's been like that, hundreds and hundreds of years, forever. So
forever,
forever,
yeah.
quote unquote.
Longer than the U.S. has existed.
Yes, which is almost every country
Yeah.
You're right.
in the world. But so they were actually had a very advanced feudal system in Mindanao. So they had their own, like, almost, you could say, national identity, except they probably didn't view it nationally,
Right.
Sure.
like the way other areas. Then Spain came. And Magellan had his head chopped off by Lapu-Lapu.
Bless.
Bless him. I don't know if he specifically did it. Like, all the paintings show like Lapu-Lapu doing it, but like his tribe did it.
Right.
So, and then like,
It's a great image.
Yeah. One historian's like, actually, he probably drowned because of his armor. I'm like, well, that's because he must have been an idiot then. Like, and then they chopped off his head. And then either way, they chopped off his head. And it was either Datu Lapu-Lapu or Chief Lapu-Lapu or one of his folks. So I'm sure he would take full responsibility for that awesomeness. But eventually Spain overtook the Philippines through basically brute force, through primarily brute force, violence, and then secondarily deception. So teaming up with other tribes, the way they did it in Mexico, the way they did it in South America, some tribes that were strong they would team up with, or maybe they would team up with weaker tribes to take on the stronger tribes. Divide and conquer was a huge tactic, the way Spain did it. And of course, the introduction of like one of the most reactionary institutions behind the United States, which is the Catholic Church.
Right.
That was like the number one, like, thing to really try to control the minds of the people, was the Catholic Church to accept this fate that they never accepted, because for the hundreds of years that Spain was colonizing the Philippines, there was over 200 revolts, right? So of course the people weren't accepting it, but they were these localized revolts. Like, it took, changes in the mode of production and history and just personal experience of the Filipino people to then take these localized revolts and turn it into a national revolt, wherein they created the Katipunan in the 1890s. But yeah, we'll get there. So like, the Spanish came in, they implemented the encomienda system from like the 16th to the 17th century, which basically the Catholic Church and the Spaniards came. It was the same system. Like, there was all this overlap between the Spanish Catholic Church and the Spanish authorities, right? Representing King Philip, which is, I guess, why the Philippines is called the Philippines. And the encomienda system basically forced all these indigenous people, forced them into peasantry, like brutally forced them into peasantry, the way like the English peasants were forced to become workers in England, like just brutal suppression of like the peasants in England to basically help then create like capitalism along with colonialism to help create capitalism and wealth for the English. So same thing, same playbook by these European assholes. So in the Philippines, they used this encomienda system initially to structure provinces, churches, political systems in order to dominate the indigenous people. And then that essentially morphed into the hacienda system, which was also linked to the galleon trade for Spain, which gave Spain lots and lots of money. So around the galleon trade and the hacienda system came in about the 18th century or so. And of course, the galleon trade was like the trade routes of plunder from Mexico, the Philippines, North America, South America through Spain. And that's how Spain was able to like fund its empire, right? For hundreds and hundreds of years, and compete with the likes of England and France in terms of their colonies. And yeah, it was this very brutal system. So there's a lot of obvious similarities between indigenous people in South America and in North America, or Turtle Island, and the indigenous folks in the Philippines and the way the Spanish used and conquered. So I'm not sure about the history of where they conquered.
It's the same sort of system. I mean, they use the encomienda system in South America and in Central America as well. So it was, yeah, I don't know.
But that turned, like I said, into the hacienda system, which oriented the economy even further to the global trade of the other colonialist powers and rising at the time imperialist powers by the late 18th century. And so then you had export crops. So like there was this newspaper called Northern Dispatch or Nordis, and it's a progressive newspaper in the Cordillera region, hence Northern Dispatch, because the Cordilleras is in the north. they had an article like that just came out today or 2 days ago that says like why farmers still farm tobacco. And it's just like why tobacco production is still a thing, even when tobacco prices go up and down.
Mm.
And it's because hundreds and hundreds of years ago through the hacienda system, tobacco growing was forced onto the peasants in like areas of northern Luzon. And I'm not sure what other areas in the Philippines there's tobacco farming, but in Northern Dispatch, they were just talking about how it was forced upon the peasants, the indigenous Igorot peasants and the peasants who are Ilocano in like Ilocos, and how instead of growing crops for them to survive, even today, they still have to grow tobacco because now it's not Spain, it's US imperialism and other multinational tobacco companies that are either connected to the United States or Britain. I can't think of any other multinational tobacco companies other than the US and Britain, but I'm sure there are. They're just, hugely destructive to the third world all over, which is pretty nuts. So the hacienda system is basically still in effect because like the Cojanco Aquino family has Hacienda Luisita, which is the size of Quezon City, which is in Manila. Quezon City, like there's Quezon City, there's Makati, Caloocan, Pasig, et cetera, et cetera. So there's this hacienda that's the size of like half of Manila, basically.
Yeah.
And that's the Cojanco family. And then there's like I've been at that hacienda before, and they're forced to grow sugar, right? So hence Central Azucarera de Tarlac, right? Thank you for sponsoring the show and everything to the Cojanco clan. So there's still haciendas, and this is where the landlords have their power, right? In this semi-feudal system. And then there's tons of haciendas. There's like one I went to, Hacienda Yulo, owned by the Yulos, and it's tons and tons of coconut trees that the peasants have to basically pay for almost everything themselves, and yet they still have to also pay for land rent, and they have to give like a bunch of their crop to intermediaries and middlemen, and then also to the Yulo family. But then also their coconut trees are being illegally cut down because it's illegal to cut down a coconut tree because it takes so long to grow. There's even a coconut authority in the Philippines that was like, you can't do that. And the Yulos were like, we can do whatever we want. They're like, sure, whatever. They cut it down to make way for ecotourism and golf course and stuff. Yeah. So the hacienda system's still alive today. So,
very cool.
So that goes all the way back to like, under Spain, it was originally this colonial feudal economy. And then we had the revolution of 1896 and you had the Katipunan. And the Katipunan was this like very revolutionary organization that came about through various means. Part of it was I don't want to say industrialization because it implies the Philippines was industrializing. It was like industrial countries like England, the United States, and Spain that were using their like comprador, like capitalist firms and companies and using them in the Philippines to exploit like the Filipino people, right? So out of the peasantry, out of this feudal system comes like this germination of the working class. And so you have sort of this working class consciousness slowly happening in the 1800s. And then of course you have some railways, you have the telegraph. That's the thing where you go beep, 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 beep. Right? Yes. Okay. Yeah. Alex says yes, I believe. So you have faster communication. You have the Philippines becoming kind of the Philippines. Like I'm Filipino is what some ilustrados would say. Like, so you had this ilustrado class of over the centuries, there was Filipinos who became rich, either petty bourgeois or bourgeois. Of course, there was also landlords, right? And compradors, but like you had this like middle class, this like petty bourgeois ilustrado class of Filipinos who were educated in Spain. And they're educated and they're like, we don't like what's going on in the Philippines. And I'm Filipino. And like, some were like, we should be free. Some were like, we should be a province of Spain. This is bullshit. Right. Like, at least we could have representation in Spanish parliament. Right. Sure. So it's like, like consciousness is getting there. Then you had the secularization movement around the same time. And the secularization movement was Filipino priests who were basically battling Catholic Spanish bishops, and like these priests and monks wanted control of their own parishes, and they didn't want to be dominated by these racist Spanish Catholic friars and bishops and priests are like, this is bullshit. Like, we're Filipino. And like, they're like, I guess we are. Yeah, let's rise up against the Spanish. And so there's like these famous priests. I can't remember all their last names, but we combine it to Gamburza, right? And these three priests were basically tried for sedition for just asserting their rights as being Filipinos and being Filipino priests. So these aren't even like revolutionary people.
Yeah.
Like these are ilustrados, bourgeois folks, but they were trying to assert their national rights against like this insane colonial system, and they were executed for that, right? And I even think there was like even some Catholic bishops who were like, I don't think we should execute them, but the Spanish authorities were like, whatever, and then they did it.
Right.
And of course, there's this huge propaganda coup. Jose Rizal, who's this very famous writer from the Ilustrados, ended up also dying, like being killed by a firing squad just because he just, I don't know, like he's just like, this is we're getting a raw deal, right? They're like, you can't even say that, and then,
Yeah.
And then you had the propaganda movement, which was all interrelated to the secularization movement and the Ilustrados at the time, like where they were writing in Tagalog, right? They weren't writing in Spanish, and they were producing literature, and they were basically saying the Philippines and the Filipino people, and that just wasn't a concept that you could have had in the 1700s because that wasn't a thing,
Sure.
right? And like the economy was where it was at, and then it took like some changes in the mode of production a little bit, and the forces of production to get that type of consciousness, right? Keeping it all histomat for y'all, or diamat or whatever. In the Philippines, we just say HM and DM. So all of this culminated to the Katipunan. I'm not going to say the full name because I don't have it on me, but it's like the highly most venerated, like the Katipunan, like the highly most venerated children of the nation.
Yeah.
It was like wow, oh my god, like sweet, bro. So you had it represented by two different people. You had people in leadership who were bourgeois, people in leadership who were of peasant and worker origin. And a lot of it was functioned around Manila, of course, and Luzon, because the peasantry in the Luzon was very connected to Manila because it was the easiest way for Manila to get what it needed, its rice, its produce, or whatever. And of course, the landlords in Luzon could easily travel to Manila. And then, of course, also Manila had where most of the workers, because that's where the shipyards were and the printing presses were, right? And then so you had this guy named Aguinaldo, who is this kind of bourgeois Ilustrado guy who represented the bourgeois line of leadership in the Katipunan. And then you had this guy Bonifacio. And Andres Bonifacio came from a peasant family and became a worker. And he represented the more working class line in the leadership. And what happened was Aguinaldo had him killed.
Nice.
Yeah. So
very cool.
So, and then basically the Katipunan, through the leadership of Bonifacio and guys like Macario Sakai, very like patriotically minded Filipino folks, despite Aguinaldo's like bougie bullshit, like they were able to drive the Spanish out of everywhere except maybe Intramuros, which was like this one garrison in Manila. But basically Spain by 1898-ish had almost no control.
Hell yeah.
Right? Almost no control of the Philippines. And this was what we call a national democratic revolution, but it was a national democratic revolution of the old type.
Sure.
So if you read stuff from the Third Comintern or the Third International, the Comintern, right, they talk about national democratic revolutions in semi-colonial, semi-feudal countries, or colonial and feudal countries. And so there's national democratic revolutions of the old type led by the bourgeois. Right. And then there's national democratic revolutions of the new type led by the proletariat or some type of proletarian party, and hopefully the Communist Party. Right. So this was a national democratic revolution of the old type, of the bourgeois line, right? Not necessarily proletarian, because they killed that leadership. So more bourgeois, like we want nationhood and we want, some form of parliament, and we don't want to be dominated by Spain. Yeah. So they won essentially, and then the United States came in.
Hooray!
Hooray. Yeah.
Come on.
Yeah. And you have a map behind you. And as you can see, the Philippines is really strategic to East Asia and Southeast Asia. It's right there, right? So that's why Spain wanted it. That's why Japan wanted it during World War II. And that's why the United States still has it, essentially, just as a neo-colony or a semi-colony. And that's why there's all this kind of intransigence or whatever, this fighting between China and the United States. So the Chinese Navy and military is building up. like around the Philippines and the Spratly Islands, and the US of course has troops in the Philippines, and like they're kind of squaring off because it's a super strategic trade route, right? It should be a neutral trade route where there is no fighting among nations just to allow trade, but the United States doesn't like it when other people encroach either legitimately or illegitimately on their nice trading zones. And of course, Spain didn't either, but Spain was weak at the time the United States came in, and they just gave up. They had a mock battle. They had a pretend battle in Manila Bay. You could look it up. There's a huge monument in my city about it, and it's like the Battle of whatever. I forget what it was called. I don't know. Manila Bay. Like MacArthur's father, like was part of this war.
Gotcha.
And then I think even MacArthur was born in the Philippines at some point. So there's like these multiple generations of Roosevelts and MacArthurs who've been oppressing the Filipino people in the first half of the 20th century. It's a family affair, guys.
Surprising.
So they had this mock battle. They signed a peace treaty. They paid millions and millions of dollars to then. The U.S. paid like millions of dollars to buy the Philippines from Spain, even though they couldn't buy it from Spain. It was the Filipino people.
Right.
So then there was the U.S. Colonial occupation. And of course, their primary mode of this was violence, and their secondary mode to take over was deception. So they got Aguinaldo on their side. I believe he was the first president, quote unquote, of the Philippines. And he supported U.S. intervention. The United States killed through directly just massacring villages. There's this one quote where this one general was just like, he wanted to turn this one area, maybe Samar, I just don't have my notes on me, but he wanted to turn it into a howling wilderness. So just kill everyone over 10.
Yeesh.
Was that person's
And
policy.
when was this?
That probably was like 1902 or 1903-ish, maybe. But the early 1900s. So the war for the occupation of the Philippines by the U.S. imperialists cost hundreds and hundreds, if not 500,000 Filipino dead.
Wasn't the 1911 built by Colt just to stop Filipinos? That caliber specifically?
I don't know how much of that is based in fact.
Yeah.
Like people they had to invent a gun to kill us, and they did introduce it just because like the resistance was so crazy. But like some people they made it they invented it because we were like just going nuts, running amok. But I think there was already an invention by they were already trying to develop it. But yeah, they anything they could introduce in their arsenal, whether it was waterboarding, which they perfected in the Philippines. They introduced waterboarding. They introduced the Colt. Whatever
the 45 ACP,
the 45 ACP, any type of modern type of warfare they could have at the time. There's tens and tens of, if not hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops in the Philippines, and the fighting lasted from 1898 to 1916. And of course, there were still colonial U.S. troops there up until right now, up until they never left. So, and secondarily, deception. So one thing they did was they got the support of Aguinaldo. They got the support of all the bourgeoisie in the old Katipunan. They killed Macario Sakai and other revolutionary folks. They finally subdued, quote unquote subdued, took over Mindanao and the Bangsamoro people, something Spain was never able to do just because of their technological advances or whatever. By 1916, the last bit of fighting against specifically U.S. empire ended, and a lot of it was they got the support of the landlords, right? And so they basically encouraged the spread of the hacienda system. Super undemocratic system, right? Feudalism is very not democratic,
right?
Not that being a worker is better, but this is way worse, right? And so with the introduction of U.S. colonialism and capitalism into Philippine society, it went from a colonial feudal nation to basically colonial semi-feudal. So the feudal aspects of the nation, of the mode of production, were changing slightly due to the globalization and colonization and capitalist imperialism that was rising at the fore. So that deeply affected the peasantry. So in the 1920s and 30s, there was tons of peasant revolts. There was the Calorum Revolt, which was a mixture of peasant grievances and religious ferocity, but patriotic religious ferocity against the Philippine constabulary and the landlords, right? And at the time, the U.S. government thought it was the communists who were fermenting this revolutionary fervor of the peasants in like the early 30s and the late 20s. But actually, at the first Congress of the Partido Comunista ng Pilipinas, they actually criticized because they were like, we should have been involved in this revolt and we weren't. We were being too like caught up in like legalisms or whatever. But that's jumping ahead. But like the whole thing about the semi-feudal economy was that the U.S. now had a strategic foothold in Asia. It was eyeing China because, of course, right, China was also colonial feudal country, right? It had its own communist party. It had its own three basic problems. And there's even like cities like Shanghai that were like totally like, I think Shanghai had like different administrative regions for like French, British, and like, French and British had like their own police forces.
Right.
Wow.
It was crazy.
Yeah, I think you guys even talked about it in that one episode.
It was in the spy episode. I think Ethan was saying that like, there were British cops for the British citizens, French cops for the French citizens. Like each one had a different like police district force and a different district, and kind of like how
they split up Berlin between England, France.
Yeah,
and
if you got arrested for committing a crime, you were tried by the people from your own government, not by the local Chinese government.
Even because we're in China.
Hey, yeah, exactly.
The bourgeoisie in China didn't care. Neither did the landlords. So the U.S. also wanted some of that action. So of course the Philippines was perfect. It was a huge coup for the U.S. bourgeoisie and the imperialists. They bankrupted the peasants. They became a reserve labor force, or the reserve army of labor, I think is what Marx talks about, which is like you have a reserve army of labor. That's why you need unemployment in capitalist societies. If everyone's employed, you could be like, fuck this, I quit. I'm just going to another job. You're like, no, oh man, I can't find anyone anymore. And then, but it's like, yeah, whatever, you could quit. I'll just get this person who's unemployed and might take, So one of the first things the Communist Party did in the Philippines was they created an unemployment like association to fight for the rights of unemployed people, because there were so many peasants now in Manila due to this introduction of U.S. imperialism and semi-feudalism who just couldn't find jobs in the country, in Manila, and they couldn't sustain themselves in the countryside. And this is something that goes on today.
Right. Because a bare minimum income is better than zero income.
Yeah, exactly.
When you're
right. So
when you're starving.
I know. So, but of course, the United States set up the Philippine Constabulary, which is now called the Philippine National Police, or the PNP. And then the Armed Forces of the Philippines was set up. U.S. colonial troops were stationed there, even though tons of them left, and they introduced homicides. So all these teachers came in to teach Filipinos about society and civilization, quote unquote, and about Christianity, even though they're all Catholic. They're like the president at the like in the early 1900s was like, we're going to Christianize this nation, and they're like, they're already Catholic. I don't know. But like they're the wrong Christian. Like, okay, I get okay, they're whatever.
There's lots of extremely racist political cartoons from the early 1900s about the Philippines. Just awful. Like Uncle Sam like walking with Filipino children representing the Philippines as a whole.
Representing one of them is usually
it's childlike races or whatever.
One of them is usually Aguinaldo.
Yeah.
I'm just holding this little kid's hand. Yeah, there's this one classroom
today, that propaganda, that same.
Yeah. So there's this one political cartoon. It's Uncle Sam in a classroom, and he's trying to teach all his colonies to read. Yeah. So in the front row, you have Puerto Rico, you have Cuba, you have Guam, the Philippines. Then you have African-American folks in the second row, and in the corner by the door, you have a Native American person. So the United States, the United States obviously saw this as just a continuation of the genocide of Native Americans, the continuation of the complete destruction of the African population, of the national minority African population in the United States, and a continuation of its just colonial, like settler colonial enterprises, but now under imperialism. So now
rebranding.
Right? So and even in the early cartoons, they would draw Filipinos as basically black, right? Even though
conflating like just people of color,
exactly,
infantilizing them.
Yeah, totally. So I can show you some of those terrible.
No thanks.
But yeah, the U.S. So like the one department that a Filipino bourgeois could not hold, and it had to be an American in charge, was the Department of Education. Yeah,
That's rich.
Yeah, right. They were just like, no. We need to Like we can't have a Filipino.
Jesus Christ.
We need to, even though they're bourgeois and they're on our side, like we need a white American to head the Department of Education in the Philippines, right? And so, of course, now all these Filipinos are now U.S. citizens. So that's how we get some Filipinos in California who become farm laborers, right, in the 1920s and 1930s. That's one of the reasons why the Philippines becomes a U.S. Commonwealth, is because now they're not a U.S. citizen anymore, so they can't necessarily leave the Philippines to go to Hawaii, where there's tons of Filipinos, along with Portuguese workers as well, and California, right? But anyway, so you had the AFP, the Armed Forces of the Philippines, as the main pillar of support for U.S. imperialism and colonialism at the time, and it still is today. Like the Armed Forces of the Philippines is the main pillar of support. Like if shit goes down, if a bourgeois person gets out of line, the AFP is there to support Uncle Sam, right? The Philippine Constabulary was there to support the landlords in the countryside and the bourgeois in the cities, right? But also while you have the creation of these reactionary institutions in a colonial Philippines, you also have the creation of like resistance, right? So yes, the Katipunan failed, and the revolution was halted. You had workers' organizations, you had patriotic workers' unions like UOD, the Union Obrero de Democrática, and it was like a patriotic workers association. And they even had some of the earliest like marches of workers in Manila in the early 1900s. They had these anti-US slogans, right? And they had these patriotic slogans, right? And it got to the point where the U.S. colonial government, with the Comprador bourgeois Filipinos and the white settler colonial like representatives of Washington, D.C., then went to the AFL. It was like, hey, can you help us organize the Filipino workers to calm them down? And the AFL was like, of course we can. Anything for Uncle Sam. We hate any form of communism or third world liberation. So the AFL totally was down with de-radicalizing the workers by the 1920s and 30s.
Maybe the AFL-CIO should have been the sponsor of this episode.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, maybe. Thanks, AFL-CIO. Yeah, at the time it was just AFL. They didn't have that split. But yeah. You had the entry of the works of Marx and Engels. And some of the early folks who were proponents of Marx and Engels was Crisanto Evangelista, who eventually became the founding chair of the Communist Party of the Philippines. And he was really instrumental in the workers' movement in Manila, in setting up UOD and like just other workers' organizations at the time. So at the same time, all this reactionary stuff is going on. You have the entry of Marx and Engels into the Philippines, and the workers are like battling their local bourgeoisie, but then they're also developing this type of revolutionary consciousness through discussions. A lot of the workers were shipyard workers, tobacco workers, and especially printing press, like printing like shop people, because at the time it was heavily intensive. Like it took a lot of workers to print books, to print newspapers, government documents and reports. It was like nuts. And I think that's Crisanto Evangelista, I believe, was a print worker as well. Like you had like the Congreso Obrero de Filipinas, which was set up in 1913. Crisanto Evangelista was also involved in that. And you had like Isabelo de los Reyes, who was another worker organizer who eventually founded, I think, the Independent Filipino Church, like the IFI, which was this like anti like Spanish Catholic, anti-reactionary, like patriotic progressive church that actually a lot of National Democratic activists still come from today. They come from the IFI. So like the movement does a lot of work with church workers, Catholic, United Methodist, UCCP, and IFI. But yeah, so like the COF, or the Congreso Obrero de Filipinas, by 1927, I believe, or so, the 1920s, they had joined the Profintern, which was the Red International of Labor Unions. So the Profintern was a committee of the Comintern.
It was in places where there wasn't like a mass communist party. Is that what you sort of?
Oh yeah. So like the Profintern was to coordinate all sorts of revolutionary work worldwide with revolutionary unions. So in industrialized nations like France, like the Communist Party of France had its own labor unions that it was able to organize. So they would join the Profintern. And in other countries where there was no Communist Party, it didn't matter if the labor union had like maybe a communist outlook. If they just had an anti-colonial outlook, they could join the Profintern. And of course, because they were joining the Profintern, they're going to get the communist outlook. So labor leaders like Crisanto Evangelista and others were able to go overseas to the Soviet Union and study for free, live for free, right? And they studied the works of Lenin. And so by 1930, the studying Marxism, Leninism, a lot of these workers who had gained all this experience over the last 3 decades from 1900 to 1930 were basically like, we need to start a communist party, right? They had some debates about the name, like, what do we call it? Do we call it communist? Do we call it this or that or blah, 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 blah. But like, ultimately they're like, yeah, we'll call it the Communist Party because we're going to join the Comintern anyway. So, yeah.
Beautiful.
So yeah, there was all that. I'll go back to like more of the history of the PKP, but just like a quick overview. You had Japanese imperialism. So Japan had its slogan, Asia for the Asians.
Sounds familiar.
Asia for the Asians. So we're kicking out U.S. imperialism. Isn't that great? And the Filipinos were like, no, like we still want to be free, right? By that point, they were a commonwealth of the United States, and the U.S. had promised them independence by 1945. So there was a lot of violent suppression, exploitation, and like just confiscation of stuff by the Japanese imperial troops for the emperor and for Japanese imperialism. And of course, this was happening everywhere. Burma, Vietnam, or Indochina, I guess at the time. China, like they had already invaded Manchuria by I think the mid 1930s. Japan had already invaded China. Yeah, right.
And 1936, 37.
Yeah, and Mao was just like telling Chiang Kai-shek, like, hey, we have to unite. Like we can't beef with each other because like we have a bigger primary contradiction. And Chiang Kai-shek was like, no, I don't care. And then it's like, all right. So yeah. So of course the communists also had to try to unite like other folks, but it was very hard. So like when the Japanese came, the comprador bourgeoisie and the landlords had a fight amongst each other, and they had a split. So some of them supported the U.S. imperialists, and then the other half supported the Japanese imperialists. None of them supported Filipinos.
Right.
So then the puppet president at the time under Japan was Jose Laurel. Laurel's big like comprador bourgeois landlord family. And by the time the United States came back, he was tried for 32 counts of treason, but the U.S. puppet president, Manuel Rojas, granted him amnesty because he's just like, it's all good, whatever. Like you're bourgeois, I'm bourgeois. Wow. We're both compradors. Let's shake hands, right? So yeah, so let's massacre some communists, which they did. So even though the communists were like the main people resisting the Japanese occupation, we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit, but they're like, they massacred them, but this collaborator with Japan was totally set free. And he later negotiated the Laura Langley Act by the mid 1950s. So he even he became a senator. He ran for president and he won, but then there's massive corruption. And so like his opponent ended up winning. Nice. Because his opponent was, like the US was like, we still don't like this guy because he was they're like, okay, well, totally mess up the electoral votes.
Did the U.S. support any sort of communist movement in the Philippines during World War II, like they did with like the National Liberation Movement in Vietnam? Like they supported Ho Chi Minh during World War II? No, they didn't do that.
They were absolutely terrified because it was their own colony. Yeah. Right. It was like they were not at all. No. Like there was no just massacres,
no, like quiet, left and right. Like we're gonna slip you some money if you fight the Japanese.
No.
Yeah. Cool.
So the Laura Langley Act, he negotiated it under President Magsaysay in the 50s, and it gave full parity rights, economic property rights for U.S. citizens and U.S. corporations.
It's very nice of him.
So I'm just like, this guy sold out the Philippines for Japanese imperialism, and he sold out the Philippines for U.S. imperialism. Like he had like a niche, and he really stuck with it. Jose Laurel.
Stick to what you're best at.
Yeah. So, and then we had, of course, the return. So basically the U.S., unlike other colonies of imperialist nations like in Indochina or whatever, or Burma or India, like from what I know, the French didn't bomb Saigon, right? The British didn't decimate the capital in like Burma, right? But the United States, like literally, like they didn't return, they invaded the Philippines, right? They invaded the Philippines and they bombed cities and towns and they flattened Manila. So Manila was quote unquote the pearl of the Orient, is what the white people would like to say, because it was so beautiful, it's so pretty. But they literally flattened everything. There was like this one church that kind of like stood out and like, yeah, because God or whatever. Yeah, but that's what some people said. But
so did the U.S. call the Manila the Pearl of the Orient the way that like that's
Ryder.
what Britain called Hong Kong was the Pearl
really?
of the Orient?
Yeah. So that was, so and you know, you see old photos of Manila before 1945, it looks completely different. Manila today is completely different. Manila today is what was built out of the ashes of the U.S. bombing of Manila, right? And there's also like U.S. like citizens and civilians who worked for the colonial government who were in like basically concentration camps. So like they were risking their own people.
Very
I guess
cool.
Not surprised.
Like, not surprised.
Yeah.
Right. I don't think they died, but yeah. So they bombed their cities in order to cripple the economy. Right. Cripple the economy.
That was going to be my next question, was why?
Yeah. To cripple the economy just because they're dicks. Right. But also it helped them dictate because the Philippines was going to be free.
Death to America.
Yes, Marx.
There you go. Ace and Marks. Yeah. So they were able to dictate unequal treaties upon the comprador bourgeois and the landlords, even though they were totally cool with unequal treaties anyway. But this just further hammered the point because, of course, the bourgeois are going to have splits. Some bourgeois are going to have a slightly more patriotic bourgeois line.
Sure.
Like, I don't want the US to tell me what to do. And the other bourgeois who are specifically partners, so compradors, like the compradors partnering with US imperialism, want maybe stuff that helps them out and helps out their US buddies. So they could dictate unequal treaties. They could dictate a constitution upon them. They granted the Philippines independence on July 4th, 1946.
It's really nice of them.
Great.
Really nice of them. Yes.
Super nice.
So
After they bombed them.
after they bombed them. So people in the Hindi is like a negative. So like they say like, the U.S. granted us independence. So yeah,
Nice.
right. So yeah,
like
they got independence or dependence or whatever.
Yeah.
Oh, right.
And they extorted a lot of privileges out of the colonial semi-feudal economy. And they also basically wanted them to pay like extortion for war damages or whatever, right?
But,
and they gave them like, like, because it was a U.S. colony, like, hey, we had war damages.
Those bonds were expensive that we dropped
Pay
on
us
you.
back. Yeah.
Pay us back. So they did that. And then Manuel Rojas, the president at the time, comprador, bourgeois asshole, landlord, and the U.S. military suppressed at the Hukbalahap. The Hukbong Bayan sa Laban, the People's Army Against Japan, right? Or Hukbalahap for short. They basically rounded them up, suppressed them, killed them, arrested them, disarmed them with the support of the revisionist communist leadership at the time, the Taruk and the Lava leadership. So they took like a right opportunist deviation trend. And they fully supported the return of the U.S. because there was going to be a free Philippines. And so they supported the disarmament of the Hukbalahap against the wishes of the peasantry, against the wishes of their own members. So not Demsen at all. Very not Demsen, very commandist, right? But they were revisionists, so they didn't give a shit. They also like ran people for elections. So they had the DA or the Democratic Alliance. And they actually won seats, like the communists won seats based off of the work that the good party members and the peasant activists had done in the countryside and the workers had done in the cities. And then the Supreme Court's like, you're not allowed to take those seats. And
amazing,
of course.
So yeah, their right deviation didn't work.
Sad.
So they basically were complicit in the massacre of their own troops, the Hukbalahap, and
just
disarming them.
like, shout out to the DSA in 2019. Just heads up.
Yikes.
Heads up. So that's when like the movement in our analysis, we basically say mala colonial, mala feudal. So the Philippines became a semi-feudal, semi-colonial society. So it was no longer directly colonial, it was now semi-colonial because of course, as I talked about, all those treaties and all the sham constitution and the sham land reform and the parity rights and all that stuff, it was not independent in the way Iran is or Venezuela is or Syria is or like other non-communist countries or communist countries that like can assert some form of independence, right? So semi-colonial, semi-feudal. that's kind of like the history up to the basically what the Philippines is now, which is semi-feudal, semi-colonial. So I'll go over a little bit more history, but I kind of want to backtrack and maybe talk about the Communist Party, because I'm sure you guys would be like interested.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So the Partido Comunista ng Pilipinas, I'll just call it PKP to differentiate it from like the current Marxist-Leninist Party.
That's good, because I'm really going to struggle to pronounce the the full name.
PKP, and then right now we have the CPP. We just use it to differentiate between the old Communist Party, which sort of still exists. Like they're just like, we still exist, and we're like, hey, like, whatever. No, you don't. You supported Marcos. Like, no, you don't.
Ooh.
Like, yeah, I know, because they had a weird. They'd been revisionist for a long time by the time. So PKP. So November 7th, 1930 was when they were founded, right? And they chose that date as their launch because November 7th was the launch of the October Revolution, right?
There you go. Nice.
I know. For the Julian calendar and the Gregorian calendar.
Right.
So whatever, I don't know. So I was like, I thought it was in October, and they're just like, no, it was, but for us it was November. I'm like, oh, okay, cool. Good to know. They were pretty much, this one guy wrote a dissertation in like the 80s about the Communist Party or about the PKP. And he just came out with a book called Comunista about the early history. And based on his dissertation, like it was pretty good. So I'm going to buy the book and check it out and read it. But he basically said that at that time, like by 1930, number one, it was super late. Almost every other communist party in Asia, in East Asia and Southeast Asia had been founded by the 1920s. Like most, like I think China was 1921 and Vietnam or the Workers' Party was at least in the mid to late 20s. Mm-hmm. So like same with Japan and Burma and India and whatever, but the PKP was founded in 1930, and they were one of the few parties in Southeast Asia that was mostly all proletarian based. They barely had any petty bourgeois people in their leadership at all.
Nice.
Yeah, very nice. Very nice. It would have helped though, maybe if there was some like petty bourgeois folks, like because they ended up alienated like a lot of the petty bourgeois. Like, so they might have been
that's
like,
fine.
they're like, no,
I see no issue.
not in a semi-colonial, semi-feudal country. You need all the help you can get. But so they were mostly city-based. So they were mostly based in Manila, mostly worker-based. But at the time, like 80 to 90% of the population was peasant-based.
Wow.
And like the leadership we're all workers and we're all involved in union organizing, very militant. The Communist Party very rapidly expanded, where they created the PKPM and the KAP, which was a mass organization. PKPM was a mass organization that had been actually created back in the 1910s or whatever, and it was a peasant association. And then they were able to transform it into a slightly more revolutionary organization, considered one of the mass organizations of the PKP at the time. And then you had CAP, and CAP was the workers like organization. And then they also had a organization for unemployed. And for
nice.
Because there's so many unemployed in Manila at the time. And of course, 1930, Great Depression, and it was super affecting the Philippines. The Philippines at the time didn't even keep track of unemployment. And then they're just like, maybe we should keep track of unemployment. Right. And they would try to send peasants back to the countryside by paying their train fare. They're like, that'll fix unemployment. And no. And like one of the early leaders of the Central Committee, I forget his name, but he died in a car crash. And at their funeral, I think maybe 20,000 people in Manila showed up.
Wow.
And the newspapers were reporting that red banners and communist propaganda will be taken down and not displayed. So many of the workers came with weapons to support their comrades in the Communist Party and to beat back the police. And so they were super, like what we call in the movement in the Philippines, G&D, grit and determined. They were very
nice.
militante.
I like that phrase.
Yeah, G&D, nice. Right? It's sort of a negative phrase in that like it slightly alienates you from the massa. So if like the masses are like, you're just like, yeah, Lenin and Stalin and whatever, and this is bullshit.
It's like tanky.
Yeah. But you're kind of like
a G&D tanky.
Yeah.
I want a shirt that says that.
G&D tanky.
Like,
yes, please.
Like if your coworker comes up to you like, hey, my boss shorted me, $10. You're like, yeah. So let's
murder him.
Let's murder him. Stalin, right? You're like,
that's a little G&D.
I don't know. As opposed to like, okay, let's talk about it and then organize them into a mass organization or a little party or whatever. But yeah, they were very G&D. So like they were constantly getting arrested, right? So one of the leaders who was also a Communist Party member of PKMP got arrested because he was giving a speech and he was just like, and then, hey, you cops over there. And the cops were like, and they were constantly being surveilled. One of their mistakes was they were too urban based, too worker based, especially for a semi-colonial or colonial semi-feudal country that had lots of peasants.
So they weren't varied enough.
They weren't varied enough. They weren't
very
nationwide.
diverse.
Yeah. Even though the Comintern was giving them lots of advice,
Right.
they also had examples with Mao in China by like the mid to late 1920s. They were already like trying to organize a peasant war and a people's war to correct deviations that were more trot at the time, is what China had.
Do you know much about the like internal cultural influence of like this group and how they interacted with each other culturally?
Which group?
The Communist Party. Or the
at the time, like how they interacted with how the
themselves,
different party,
like what kind of culture the communists were able to create in the Philippines.
In Manila, in the Philippines. So like they, Dempsey, ML, they would debate each other a lot. They would criticize their liberalisms. They would criticize their right and left deviations. They just had a hard time applying the theory. They were a little bit too dogmatic at the time. They were still good. They still did good work, but they were slightly too dogmatic where they weren't looking at the material conditions of the country, but they were doing a lot of good work. So some of their like more GND or left deviations, right? Like, so this one leader of the PKMP, the Peasant Association is like, hey, you cops, you don't get paid any money. Like they didn't get paid anything, like the Philippine constabulary. So that's why they would just extort people for money. So they're like, and those guns that you're pointing at us, one day you're going to point them at your bosses, at your police chief. And they went, what? And then they arrested him. And then Crisanto Evangelista, who was known for being very soft spoken, being very like chill. He could read. He would there was this one journalist, or maybe he was an American Communist Party member, because there was fraternal relations between the CPUSA and the PKP because they were the colony of the United States.
Right.
There was some Browderist revisionist tendencies, but the people who went to the Philippines actually did offer some pretty good advice and very proletarian. But they talked about there was like a meeting of 700 dock workers, and Crisanto Evangelista was commanding the room. Wow. He was just reading from a document. He wasn't like makibakawak matakot. He wasn't like I don't know how to say it in English. He wasn't very militant in his speech, right, and very super loud and whatever. And then he would just any questions? People what about this? And you just answer them, right? But he could get very militante, right. So there's this one speech where he was speaking. It was during a long march. I don't think it was May Day, but it was one of the marches, because when they joined the Comintern, there was the Comintern has these are our holidays that you have to march and protest at. They're like, okay, so it was probably one of those days. There's May Day, International Women's Day, then there's November 7th, and then there's Anti-Imperialist Day, I think was a holiday that all the Comintern parties had to adhere to. So communist parties all over the world on this one day for Anti-Imperialist Day, which was pretty cool, right? And so basically the cops were there. There's 5,000 people at this thing. They wanted Crisanto Evangelista to speak, and they were basically he got warned, listen, if you get too rowdy, you're gonna get under arrest. And he was just whatever. Yeet! And then he just started we need to overthrow the government and U.S. imperialism is our enemy. They're that's it, you're under arrest. So the leadership was constantly getting arrested.
G&D.
Very G&D. So they should have been underground, right? It should have and they had to go underground because they eventually were outlawed. Right after within a year or two, they were outlawed. There was all of this momentum in the Communist Party, but then there was some of these again they were a little bit too dogmatic, not in a revisionist way. Dogmatism doesn't mean you're a revisionist, right, or even being military adventurous doesn't mean you're a revisionist, as long as you correct your mistakes and you accept proletarian criticisms in these principles and you correct them. So they would try to correct things here and there, and even the Comintern would just be you guys are you need to calm down there, buddy. Japan's gonna be coming soon, so you might want to unite with some of these bourgeois people. Like Crisanto Evangelista, when he got arrested, had to go to the Supreme Court, and then his lawyer Santos, and this guy Santos, his brother Pedro Abad Santos was the chairman of the Socialist Party, which was mostly peasant based at the time, and he ended up becoming like. The lawyer for Crisanto Evangelista ended up becoming like, I think, the deputy or the secretary of
the Department of Justice.
Department of Justice.
Yeah.
There we go. So of course it was named the same in the Philippines.
Of course.
And so the communists did have some strong bourgeois allies. And so his lawyer was just like, listen, you're going to lose. Like, and the Supreme Court had 3 white Americans and 3 comprador bourgeois Filipinos on it at the time. And then so he's like, if you lose, you could go to the Supreme Court in the United States in Washington, D.C. because they were a colony. So you could still appeal. Right. So he's like, instead of making a defense, because I know we're going to lose, just go off on them.
Nice.
And he went off and just talked about how they were corrupt and terrible, and like the U.S. needs to get out of the Philippines and the proletarians will unite and overthrow them. It was not maybe the best strategy, and then it was pretty cool though.
Yeah.
Like, shit posting the Supreme Court in real life, right?
Goals.
So like, but his lawyer, it was on the advice of his lawyer too. Like, so he's like, just go ham,
Just go off.
and then so this
Yeah.
white American, like this one judge, he was so pissed. He actually left in the middle of his closing argument, and he just didn't even hear it. And they're like 6-0, you're guilty of sedition, right? So like the party had to go underground, and they did alienate some of the bourgeois. So they ended up alienating Santos. Like they said he was a bourgeois dog, and I was just like, dude, this guy like helped you in the Supreme Court. And there would be these other like bourgeois patriotic organizations that were like some of them were Gandhiite. They're like nonviolence, man. And the party was like, that's so stupid, because they were workers, right? They were just violently suppressed. So you could like maybe shit post them internally, like with yourselves, but then they'd be like, you're just a bunch of imperialist idiot dogs. And like these were organizations that were actually like, we support the communists, we support Crisanto Evangelista in his fight against the colonial government. And then they were like, no, the communists are just an agent of Russia. And they totally like, oh, that was bad mass work, guys. That was not good. So they were like isolating themselves too much. That's one lesson that like China used, is like they would not isolate the national bourgeoisie, and they would not isolate the petty bourgeoisie. Like they held firm to their basic alliance, which was the peasants and the workers, and the prolet were the leading force, and the peasants in China were the main force. Right. But if there was segments of the petty bourgeoisie that were progressive, even if they weren't communists, bring them in, like organize them. And like if they didn't want to be members of the Communist Party, they would, even if they just wanted to be critical supporters, they were against Chiang Kai-shek or they were against Japan. And so like they handled it a little bit better than the people in the Philippines. So those were some of the issues, but they were still a good prolet party. Like the fact that there was a proletarian party meant that the working class and the peasantry in the Philippines had advanced ideologically, politically, and organizationally. Politically, they wanted, like their overthrow of the U.S. imperialism, and they wanted the overthrow of the comprador bourgeois landlord system. And organizationally, they were, a communist party. So obviously, ideologically, that means they were able to accept it. Like after trial and error, after all this, like, dialectical, if you want to use dialectics, like, they started workers' orgs, they were reading Marx. The workers' orgs were protesting. They weren't getting anywhere. They would have victories. They would have losses. Then they linked up with the communist parties, these ML parties. And then like step by step, like, building up like theory, practice, higher level of theory, higher level of practice, they develop a communist party. So this was good. By the late 30s, there was like seeping revisionism into the party, especially introduced by the Browderites of the CPUSA. So there's this Popular Front policy that the Comintern introduced to differentiate it from its like third line policy or whatever of the late 20s, the early 30s. And the Popular Front policy was to unite against fascism, right? And so the way the Chinese Communist Party implemented it was that we will merge our proletarian People's Army, our Red Army, into the Gumindang Army, but we will keep some of our army as a Red Army in cooperation with Chiang Kai-shek and the Gumindang, because Japan is just a target. We can't have two targets. You need just one target to focus on, and we need to target Japanese imperialism. So we'll merge our proletarian army with the Gumindang Nationalist Army. Even though they massacred our people in the early 30s, the late 20s, we'll work with them. But we'll keep our Communist Party membership. We're going to try to recruit people into the Communist Party. We're going to try to recruit people into the People's Army. We're going to still build up organs of democratic and political power, basically Soviets in the countryside for the peasants. We're going to cooperate as much as we can in order to overthrow Japanese imperialism, but maintain our organizational and ideological integrity and maintain the leadership of the working class and the peasantry, right? So that's how they implemented it. The United States, the CPUSA, implemented it by subsuming themselves in the Democratic Party and basically tailing the Democratic Party and just being like, Roosevelt's the best, and we don't want to have any sorts of strike actions during World War II. So they were already pretty much revisionist by the 30s, right? The CPUSA influenced the leadership of the PKP and Crusato Evangelista to basically negotiate with the government in order to become a legal organization. The government also was kind of down with that because they knew Japan was coming, right? There was already a boycott Japanese products campaign by the late 30s, even before Japanese imperialism invaded. So the bourgeoisie was getting nervous. So they're just like, all right, we'll release the leaders. And then the PKP merged with the PSP, with the Socialist Party, which had been founded by Abad Santos. And they merged without any prep. They're just like, we're going to implement the Popular Front by just merging with this bourgeois socialist party. So you had this very militant but flawed proletarian PKP based in Manila. And then you had the more kind of bourgeois democratic PSP, mostly based in the countryside with the peasants. And they just merged without any ideological preparation or any type of prep. There was all these bourgeois elements that seeped into the PKP, one of them being Luis Taruk, and then Vicente and Jose Lava. So they had like the Lava brothers and Luis Taruk, and they ended up becoming the leadership in the PKP. And so like they just had a lot of mistakes. They changed their constitution, which mirrored the CPUSA constitution. So the CPUSA constitution was like, we uphold the Declaration of Independence or something.
Oh, no.
Or the Constitution. And they could be like, oh, well, because the Constitution is about rights and the Communist Party is about rights, right? Whereas before the CPUSA was like, we want to overthrow everything.
Yeah.
We're going to overthrow the Consti, and we're going to try to liberate the Black national minority and the Black Belt and create, they were legit for a bit, and then they changed. So then the PKP, PSP merger party, their constitution was, we uphold the Commonwealth. We uphold the Constitution of the Commonwealth of the Philippines, right? Yeah, so that kind of happened, and then but Japan invaded. They did create the Hukbalahap, so where they didn't have an armed struggle in the early 30s, they did have finally the Hukbalahap in the 1940s in order to resist Japan. But the right opportunist line of Vicente Lava implemented a retreat to defend policy. So they were making gains against Japan, and they're like, we're going to retreat and just like wait for the United States to come back. And so like that had happened at like, I think a Central Luzon Bureau conference in February of 1942. And then that policy ended up getting rejected by most of the cadres, most of the cadres in September 1943, March 43 and then September 1943. So like, just a mere like whatever 6 months later, like they're just like, this is dumb policy. So they're able to gain back some land. They were able to like build up some sort of peasant power in the countryside while the absentee landlords had like fled to Hong Kong or the United States. And of course, as we know, like despite all these gains, the Lava and Taruk leadership then went like, forget it. We don't need the Hukbalahap anymore. We're going to run elections in the Democratic Alliance, and we're going to allow the U.S. to come back and grant us independence.
Very cool. Grant us independence.
Yeah, grant us independence.
Please,
right?
Daddy. Independence.
Yeah. So, but then they swung left again. By the late 40s, they didn't see it was working. So that's the thing about revisionists. or even people who don't have a proper proletarian line, like the same people will go left opportunistic line, right opportunistic line.
Yeah.
It's two, like same coin, same person, two different
Why
sides.
is that?
No ideological cohesion. So
Yeah,
that's why
exactly.
Trotsky would be like, the NEP is totally stupid. You're stopping the NEP too early. And then it's like, will you make up your mind?
Right.
Like
Yeah.
the Communist Party of China should not unite with the nationalists. They should fight the nationalists. And then like they're fighting the nationalists. And like Trotsky would be like, they should unite with the nationalists.
Yeah.
You're like, you just said two different. That's why like this.
One of my favorite memes is the like the political compass, and it has Trotsky, but it's like Trotsky all over the fucking board, just like left, right, authoritarian, libertarian, just everywhere is Trotsky.
For Demsen, against Demsen,
Yes, exactly.
commandist, or
Yes.
So
Yeah,
it's
like
it's,
let's go in and crush the Makhnovites, but also we shouldn't be going in and oppressing the yeah, I mean
kulaks.
it's just like everything exactly.
Yeah. So that's why, right? They could not apply Marxism and Leninism
Right.
to the concrete conditions of the Philippines and practice it because they were never MLs to begin with. Right. Like you could
Right.
have that's a revisionist is like maybe they started out as a communist, but they're not. Like maybe they think they are and they read the stuff, but they're not. They're bourgeois.
Right.
Right. So like, and it was really sad because the party built up networks of peasant power in central Luzon, in the countryside. They had a network of intelligence operatives. They had couriers. They had red power that lasted up until the early 1950s. There was a heavy reliance on peasant women. Women were one of the most key components to revolutionary power in this very patriarchal, semi-feudal, semi-colonial country. So the fact that these peasant men would at least accept some form of leadership from women was like a huge just victory. Like, but it wasn't because the revisionist leadership was doing these policies. It's because it was being implemented properly by the peasant activists and the workers and the cadres on the ground who were genuine Marxist-Leninists, right? So they swung left. So then these HOOK associations or veteran associations eventually became the HMB or the Hukbong Magpagpalayan ng Bayan, the People's Liberation Army, right? And so in 1950, they were just like, within 2 years, we will win. You know, that's insane. That's the craziest thing you could ever do. Like, there was no analysis of the peasantry. There was no analysis of like protracted People's War.
I bet it was good for recruitment though.
Yes, at first, yes, and then the recruits were killed because military adventurous errors, because they would do these huge tactical offensives that made no sense, and then like they would just play their hand in the armed forces of the Philippines and the U.S. Intelligence operatives and what do they call them? Like the people who embed, like the U.S. operatives who embed with people. They're like trainers or advisors.
Yeah.
The U.S. advisors embedded with them. And at the time, Ramon Magsaysay, who became president but was a general, like they were able to crush them because they would just play their hand. And they would just be like, well, they're all there. And then instead of diversifying their strategies and tactics and building up political power slowly with the examples that had happened in Vietnam, in China, examples that they contemporarily had, they just chose to ignore because they went from right opportunist to military adventurous left line, right?
We should talk about military adventurism because I've seen that quite prevalent in like the U.S. left,
Like Red Guards Austin or or like particular sects of anarchism, the illegalists and whatnot, who are like, we're gonna
propaganda
the deed,
yeah.
right? We're gonna run out and like, if we put a pig's head on this library door, that'll suddenly awaken the proletarian fervor.
And it's weird that it's coming from quote unquote Maoists, who I just view as petty bourgeois anarchists and Marxist and Marxist dressing.
Spicy.
Yeah, I was gonna say shit.
Because endorsed.
My name's Daniel. I live in Canada. I'm French.
They're gonna nail a pig's head to your door.
I know, right? Because like
it's a free meal.
If you apply, right? It is a free meal.
Free meal.
The ear, I like the ear. I'll make it lechon. Lechon is like a really popular fiesta dish in the Philippines. It's
nice.
Roasted pig, and the ear is fantastic. But they could apply MLM, and if they apply it properly, they would criticize what they're doing is basically left opportunism and military adventurous. But if they're petty bourgeois and they don't have a proletarian class line and they have a petty bourgeois line, it doesn't matter.
It's very short-sighted.
Yeah, it doesn't matter if they say MLM, Gonzalo thought, whatever, blah, 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 blah. Jose Marie Sisson is dumb for some reason, even though like, I'm like, why are you guys insulting like third world revolutionaries in India and the Philippines because they don't follow?
So like, why is it appealing?
Military adventurism?
Yeah.
For specifically for the petty bourgeois, it's a way to, or petty bourgeois line of thinking, instead of painstaking mass work, where you build up a proletarian revolutionary movement of peasants, petty bourgeoisie, working class, right? It's like, let's do the right-wing deviation. We're going to have the Democratic Alliance get elected to parliament and win that way. And we'll do it quick. Okay, that doesn't work. Let's have we're just going to win militarily and we're going to win quick. They just want quick, right? They don't want painstaking proletarian work to do it. So that's why the same people will sway both ways.
On top of that, if you think about it, it also has that like facade and that imagery of doing quote unquote work. And they're really attracted to that idea of showing up, like looking like they're showing up, but they don't want like the drudging, long-term, hard, like tedious work that actually goes into it. They just want to look like they're doing something.
Yeah.
So it's very aesthetic.
Yeah. That aesthetic.
Yeah. So no, they look at the Cultural Revolution and they go, I will apply this aesthetically to these conditions without concretely looking at what's the essence of the Cultural Revolution, what's the essence of the lesson. And even in the Philippines, we look at the correctness of the Cultural Revolution, and then we look at like what were the mistakes, and then the cultural work we apply in the Philippines, and hopefully a cultural revolution, the lessons of not alienating yourself from the masses are applied. But we're not going to be like, well, they did ballet, so we're going to do ballet. And like they had Little Red Books, so we're going to give everyone Little Red Books. Like, but that's how maybe some people in the first world who have a petty bourgeois class analysis, even if they think they have a Marxist analysis, they will just aesthetically apply it. And they'd be like, well, this is what it is because this is what I saw in a video. And therefore that's what I'm doing.
I see that very, very frequently with the food shares, because it'll be like we've experienced this personally with a anarchist group. So they analyzed that the Black Panthers would do community food shares. So they would show up at the local park where the highest population of houseless people was, and just make burritos or whatever and hand it out, which is fine. But they would totally ignore anybody else in need. And it was specifically focused on those people. And you were not doing any work if you didn't show up to those. And it was incredibly costly resource wise for not having
and it was
that's not even
and they also didn't like it if we were using that as an opportunity to then
hand out pamphlets
or educate people. They were like that's not what this is about. It has to be purely pure,
propaganda of the deed,
right?
So that's just a bourgeois line.
Right. It is very much so. Like if you're not building something else, I mean, like the lumpen are not going to rise up and overthrow the government, right? Like they are in the most subjugated position, and therefore like you're not going to. That's
a huge sector that we organize in the Philippines is the lumpen proletariat. It's a big sector we organize.
Not here in the US. I mean, it does exist, but like it
is large
and it is huge. And feeding people is good, but that's not going to lead to the revolution, right? Like that's not going to take us anywhere in terms of at least here in the US.
It will make you look good as a revolutionary on Facebook, though.
Yes, and that is what.
And maybe that's what Luis Taruk and Jesus Lava. If there was Facebook, they'd be like, see you in 2 years. Hashtag communism.
They make a hashtag for it.
So there's a lot of mistakes. Basically what was going on was there was no rectification, no criticism. So even at least in the 1930s when they were making mistakes, they were viewing it as like we need to rectify. So like the Calorem revolt, they're like, we criticize that we were not a part of this. The PKMP was very weak in the countryside, and that was like we criticize like we should be better. They wouldn't necessarily apply it just because there was too much craziness, not enough cadres, too many of them getting arrested, too many tasks. But by the 50s, they weren't even like, they would rectify some things because they were forced to by their party members, but they weren't really looking critically. So like by the time of the 1950s, they had this weird thing where they split up their leadership. They had 2 lines of leadership. So they didn't even learn their lessons from the early 30s. They had Politburo in and Politburo out. The Polit in was based in Manila, and they were all arrested because they were based in Manila, and that's where the enemy's the strongest. Then the Polit out was based in the Sierra Madre in the countryside. And then so the army was able to confiscate all these documents from the Polit in Manila, and a lot of them were strategies and like about People's War and where they were in the countryside. And then so like the leftist military adventurous line of the HMB didn't work. So then Taruk gave up for, I think, the 3rd time. There's all these photos of Taruk. Like Taruk is like, I'm giving up to Ramon Magsaysay. And then like 5 years before that, there's a picture of Luis Taruk, and he's like shaking the hand of Corino. He's like, I'm giving up the Corino. And then there was a guy in the Central Committee, a white American soldier who was on the Central Committee of the PKP. He was like a U.S. soldier in the Philippines in the 40s. He's like, communism. All right. And he just stayed, and like he did some good work, but he ended up being like one of the big revisionists and one of the biggest critics of like the National Democratic Movement in the 60s and 70s, just because he was just like, everything we did was correct and right, and nothing we did was wrong. And then there's a picture of him giving himself up to then General Magsaysay before he was president. Right. And then like, so they're just giving up left and right. The party by the late 1950s swung back to right opportunist legalism. But they were underground because they were made illegal, just like how the CPUSA was made illegal in the early 1950s, I guess, during the Red Scare. By the way, love the movie.
You
movie commentary. I watched it.
No.
Yeah, because
So
listening to the podcast without watching it wouldn't make any sense.
Yeah.
So I was just like, I had to watch it. So
bad.
so bad. So
I still haven't watched
so
it.
the Lava, he got rid of basically Demsen and mass work and created the single file policy where like, you only knew 2 communists, and like I knew communist A, I was communist B, and this person's communist C. And then Jesus Lava would give a directive, and he would tell it to A, then he would tell it to me, and I'd have to tell it to C. And then he was a fugitive in the city, and he would just stay in safe house to safe house to safe house, building up on the old networks that he'd had dating back to the 30s. And he was just listening to radio and issue political directives. Right. Yeah.
Was that like, how did that go?
Yeah, how'd that go? That's what I was wondering.
I mean, in terms of
he ended up
security
giving up in
culture,
1960.
it's good.
Yeah. Security wise, it was okay.
It sounds effective for security.
It's very ineffective. So like the IRA,
Yeah.
even Jerry Adams tried to implement this single file policy in the IRA, and any IRA unit that implemented it just does not work because you need to meet collectively. You need to discuss it collectively. You need to discuss with the masses. You need to meet secretly, but collectively.
Right.
And then if you don't know any other communist, then communist C, and she gets arrested.
It's too
they're
disconnected.
like, all right,
now the
I
chain is
do
broken and
know
you
what
can't
to do, right?
Yeah.
It's way too
It wasn't
disconnected.
effective, and it was just this one dude just being like, do this today, do that tomorrow. And then it was totally not what it was, even in the 40s, even in the early 1950s, when it had a base of power in the countryside in Luzon. But then that was another mistake, was it was only based in Luzon, not in the Visayas. And they even criticized this in the 30s, like, we should be in the Visayas. There's huge plantations in the Visayas. We should be there. They're like, we resolved to be there. And then like, they just never went, right? We resolved to be in Mindanao, but they just never did it. And by, I think 64 or 65, he gave up. He's like, I give up. And then, but still technically the Communist Party, the PKP.
Was there like a benefit to giving up, or like what?
Yeah. Like, you're bourgeois, you're tired of this shit. Like, you're doing all these mistakes and you're doing all this hard work that doesn't go anywhere because you're an idiot. And then you're just like, give up. Like, well, I'm just going back home. And then like, you go to jail for a bit, and then like, you're like, all right. Like, so that was the only.
Go on with your life.
Go on with your life, right? So basically, by the mid 50s, there was no meaningful revolutionary mass movement in the Philippines. Hashtag sad. Hashtag sad face. To challenge the 3 basic problems. But by 1959, students in the NCR began Marxist study groups. And they began to study what they called MLMZT, so Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought. And they began to apply it to the conditions of the Philippines, whereas before, like, maybe party members were a little bit too dogmatic. These non-party members, but revolutionary youth and students, were trying to apply it to the Philippines. They had anti-CAFA mass actions. So CAFA was the Committee of anti-Filipino activities, just like the HUAC, I guess, the House of Un-American Activity Committees. And so they were trying to persecute all these people on campus, and these professors, Jose Maurice Husson, who came from a small landlord family, was a professor at the time, and he was also involved in one of these groups to fight for the basic freedoms and academic rights of the students and like the bourgeois professors. And so they began studying MLMZT alongside revolutionary trade union folks. So by the 1950s, there was NAFLU, so the National Association of Federated Labor Unions, which is now part of Kilusan Mayo Uno, which is a national democratic, revolutionary, anti-imperialist, Marxist labor center in the Philippines. It's like the largest. It's our AFL-CIO. Except it's anti-imperialist and Marxist and revolutionary. It's like, like the AFL-CIO. If it was good, right? Well, and the AFL-CIO is a labor center, but for U.S. labor unions that are for shitty stuff.
Sure.
And the KMU is a labor center, but they're anti-imperialist. So NAFLU, so they linked up too, and were studied Marx and Lenin and Stalin, and like they're like, what's going on with Khrushchev? This guy seems like an idiot, and then like criticizing him. And then reading Mao, and they also got helped by the PKI, the Communist Party of Indonesia. The Communist Party Indonesia was the largest communist party not in power in the world at that time, and so they really helped them out. Like they, I guess, try to help the PKP. They're like, hey, what are you doing? They're like, fuck off, Indonesia. They're like, all right, but like we'll help these students and workers who they need help. And so they introduced to them like Indonesian Society and Revolution, which was a text that talked about how Indonesia was semi-feudal, semi-colonial. It had a lot of Mao stuff in there. So they started applying this stuff, and they started applying Mao and ML to like the conditions of the Philippines concretely. So there was the formation of Masaka. So by 1963, you had these national democratic, revolutionary, legal, open mass organizations forming. So you had NAFLU with the workers, and then you had like students and the petty bourgeoisie forming their own patriotic groups. You had Claro Amorecto, who was a national bourgeois figure in the Philippines who was against U.S. imperialism. Wasn't a Marxist, but he was against U.S. imperialism, and his writings were becoming popular, right? Then you had Masaka, which was the peasant association in the Philippines that was also national democratic and against landlords. So you had all this activity, right? All this activity that the PKP could have utilized to grow its membership, and it didn't. Because they were revisionist, they were separated from the masses, they had no mass organizations anymore. So all these mass organizations that were applying ML to the Philippines, and all these ex-members of the PKP were getting together and linking up with the workers and the students and doing studies and trying to rectify the errors of the past, but without the help of the PKP, right? So you had Masaka founded in 63, NAFLU founded in like 56 or 57, and these student groups like starting in 1959. By 1964, you had the largest national democratic mass organization in like the history of the Philippines, founded in this little YMCA in Manila. It was called Kabataan Makabayan.
What was their primary goal?
Which
was it revolution, or I mean the groups combined?
It was to overthrow U.S. imperialism.
So where did that go wrong?
It didn't go wrong. They ended up founding the party.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but this is not connected to PKP. So the PKP went wrong. The Communist Party at the time went wrong. They were not connected to these groups at all.
Okay.
So all this, the PKP wasn't doing shit. So all the youth and the students and the workers, they're like, well, they're not doing anything. We have to do something.
Right.
So they were already forming mass organizations. These weren't mass organizations that like Communist Party members created and then built up. These were already being built up organically due to the conditions of the Cultural Revolution, the Great Debate between the Soviet Union and China, between U.S. imperialism being just so brutal in the Philippines, Clark Air Base being used to fly bombing runs on Vietnam, the popularization of the war and Ho Chi Minh's writings, right? This was all this fervor was going on in the early 60s to mid 60s. So then you had KM, or Kapitan Mangkabayan, and they propagated the solution to the Philippines, which was like a national democratic revolution with a socialist perspective. So ND revolution with the socialist perspective. So going back to the Comintern, the Third International, and their perspective and analysis of semi-colonial countries and colonial countries, and they just applied it, like reading Stalin, reading Mao, right? And that was their program, right? So, and this was KM, the founding chair at the time was Jose Maria Sison and Julieta de Lima. So that harkened back to the study groups from 1959. So all this mass work is happening, but there's no party. So eventually the party gets word of some of these worker and youth activists, and they're like, these guys are really popular. We should recruit them to the party. So then they do. They recruit them to the party. They're like, okay, we'll join the party. Like, all right, we'll see what happens. And they joined the party, and then they started a summing up. And they started a summing up of the ideological, political, military, and organizational errors of PKP, and it was rejected by the leadership.
Of course.
Yeah. So they said, no, you're insane. So they tried to unite with the leadership. And that's kind of like, how do you know a party is proletarian, right? Like, because there could be all these different parties. And like, if a party is not connected to the masses
Right.
or does not accept criticism, they're probably not proletarian. They're probably dogmatic or revisionist. So the workers at the time, the worker organizers in Naflu and the peasant organizers in Masaka and the organizers of the youth in Kapatan Makabayan, they're just like, what do we do? Like, we need to refound the party based on the principles of Marxism and Leninism, Mao Zedong thought. And they said MLMZT because PKP claimed to be ML. So they're just like, well, if we just say we're PKP ML, then people are just going to get confused. And like, we really like Mao's application to semi-feudal, semi-colonial countries. And obviously the PKP is not doing it. So in 1968, on December 26th, because Mao's birthday, they founded the CPP MLMZT, or the CPP MLM. We'll just say CPP just to make it simple. And they founded the party in 68, and they started a rectification campaign before the party was even founded. So it was called the UDKP, or the First Great Rectification Movement. And it was to learn all the lessons of the mistakes, what worked, what didn't work, where it went wrong of the PKP, especially the PKP-PSP merger party.
And the rectifications were sort of like massive self-crit sessions, basically.
Self-crit and education movements. Like, any rectification campaign is basically an education movement. Right. So the document that ended up being rejected by the PKP leadership ended up being called Rectify Errors and Rebuild the Party. And the campaign pretty much lasted until 1972 or whatever.
Oh, wow.
Like, it took a while. So like, the party was founded in 68, and they had already linked up with remnants of the old HMB, of the old Red Fighters. They were still Red Fighters, just not connected to the PKP leadership in Central Luzon. And one of them was Cadante, young Red Fighter. So Cadante and like Julieta de Lima and Jose Maria Sison, like, they were able to link up and apply MLM ZT to the concrete conditions of the Philippines. And so by March of 69, so like just 5 months later, they had announced the founding of the MPA, or the New People's Army, right? They were able to basically start to build up armed struggle in the countryside with a peasant power base. So they're already, like, within a year, they've already started an armed struggle, and they already have the MPA under the leadership of the Proletarian Party. They already have a line that was like, overthrow the semi-feudal, semi-colonial government, expel U.S. imperialism, build up organs of political power in the countryside, protracted people's war with the strategy of encircle the cities from the countryside, and being led by a proletarian leadership, right? And based off a basic alliance between workers and peasants, right? So already within like a year, like, they had already done more than what had been done in the 1930s or 1940s.
Right.
Then there was a women's bureau of the party had founded Makibaka, which was like large, still is a large nationwide revolutionary national democratic women's organization. I was going to say Duterte. When Marcos declared martial law, all these organizations went underground, and they stayed underground, and they're still underground now. But there was huge outbreak. Like, Marcos had been elected in 64. Or like 65 or something like that. And then he had a second election in 69. So even by the mid 60s, people were seeing that the Marcos presidency was actually a fascist dictatorship, even though it wasn't declared martial law. It didn't declare martial law till 1972.
Right.
Right. So there's all this stuff going on in 70s. So there's huge protest movements in Manila in 1970 called the First Quarter Storm. Right. And there was youth and workers and transport workers just like aggressively asserting their national democratic rights, especially against who they called the U.S. Marcos puppet dictatorship, right? And so like there was these huge street battles and clashes, and the youth and the workers were throwing petrol bombs and nail bombs and like fighting the police, and like police would use tear gas. They would even fire submachine guns into the crowds of tens of thousands of people, and it was just this like total revolutionary fervor in the streets of the people being led by the party. So of course, if there's no party, nothing would have come of it, right? There would have been no proletarian leadership. There would have been no mass organizations to really move the people's grievances into a revolutionary way, because the PKP could have never done it. By that time, the PKP leadership was pro-Marcos, because they said, oh, Marcos is industrializing the Philippines. We're no longer colonial or feudal or whatever, even though now in like there was a study done in 2015, there's less industrialization now in the Philippines than there was in the 1950s.
Yeesh.
So the semi-feudal economy has only gotten worse, right? And in the 70s, the PKP leadership is like, the CPP MLM was just created by the CIA, and we support Marcos. And we're like, all right, like we support we support martial law, right? So Bantas Militar, martial law. So also in 1970, Philippine Society and Revolution was written. And this was just this political document I was telling you about that goes over the history of the Philippines, the three basic problems, and then the solution, which is like, you know, the three weapons that the people can wield, which is the party, the National United Front of all the classes supporting proletarian leadership and supporting armed struggle, right? So this like book like took off. It was like people, it was illegal. Like people were doing study circles and reading it and wanting to join Kapitan Makabayan or wanting to join Makibaka or wanting to join the party. And then like, so still there's no like martial law, right? And the Communist Party now has roots all over the country. And not only that, the NPA has roots all over the country, like not just Luzon, but also Visayas and Mindanao, right? And then something happens where there was a petrol increase in 1971 of like, I don't know, 3 centavos or whatever, which was huge back then, right? It was really big. And so the transport workers in Naflu just started to blockade the streets. And then the students in Kapitan Makabayan and SDK, another national democratic youth organization that's very militant, and probably also like, you know, had members that were in the Communist Party, joined the protest, and they blockaded the streets and they blocked off the University of UP Diliman, the main like public university in the Philippines. It's like, I don't know, what's a big public university in the United States? UC Berkeley, I guess, is like kind of bougie, but
massive bougie.
You know, and then you had Ateneo de Manila, which was like the Yale of the Philippines, right? So private university. And even Ateneo de Manila had militant bourgeois activists who were like proletarian and full-time activists and all that stuff, right? So like, cool. So they blocked off UP Diliman and they basically created the UP Diliman Commune. They called it the Diliman Commune. And like there was teachers who were supporting it. There was no classes, KM and SDK and other NatDem or National Democratic teachers were doing studies of Marx and Lenin, and they were studying the PSR, and the party was recruiting people left and right. So like KM's recruiting people left and right, Makibaka's recruiting people left and right, and the party. And then many people who go to UP Diliman, they're like, well, I'm from like Batangas. Okay, like go to Batangas. Here's like your documents. Here's your first recti documents. Here's a constitution of the party. Here's how to do People's War. And they're like, I'll do it. And they did, and they went. Yeah. Right. And then like, I'm from Davao, like, oh, you and 2 other people go to Davao, start a party cell, and then like link up with whoever you can to start an NPA unit. And they did. And like, so even though the Diliman Commune was this very short thing, like it was for a reason. It wasn't this petty bourgeois decadence protest for protest's sake. Sure. Oh, we're going to block off the street. Like they did it for material reasons in order to radicalize the petty bourgeois students. And so the party was able to spread its wings even like further and really deeply root itself with the masses and really learn the lessons from the first rectification movement about military adventurism and right-wing opportunism and like all that stuff. So like the party then set up deep roots. Then a year later, the Liberal Party, whose kind of like scion was Ninoy Aquino, who was actually friends with Jose Maria Sison, and he was a landlord, a big landlord. But he hated Marcos, and the Communist Party hated Marcos. And so like he was like friends with Sison when he was still a KM member and was not a party member yet. And Marcos threw a bomb at the Liberal Party, like at their like rally, and it injured a bunch of people. And then Marcos was like, it was the Communist Party that did it. And they're everywhere and there's millions of them. And I need to declare martial law. Now, and the Communist Party is like, there's not millions of us. There's like maybe like 10,000 of us. Right. Like there's maybe like at that point, maybe only 10,000 members and maybe 1,000
burning of the
members
Reichstag sort of thing.
Yeah. So, you know, and still today people go like, oh yeah, it was Sison and Aquino. How come Aquino wasn't there? Like he didn't get killed, kind of like the weird 9/11 conspiracies that you hear. You're like, that's not true. That's terrible.
Yeah.
So like he declared martial law. So all this stuff was going on. And he, you know, basically declared martial law. And up to like even the late 1970s, like the errors that the party was doing, like based off just their summaries and their summing ups, which you can like get online or whatever. Most of their errors were they were not systematic and they were not like widespread. So basically they were errors just because they were errors, like people make mistakes, right? And they rectified them. Right. So like that was even to
sounds like there's a lot to be learned from that.
Yeah. By 1978, there was some subjectivism and opportunism that was starting to systematically creep in to the party. They called it eclecticism. And so there's this group in MR. So the Manila Rizal region, like Rizal is just right next to Manila. So the party had like a Manila Rizal bureau. And they called themselves Le Monde, like after the French newspaper Le Monde. So you could already tell by their name. You're like, you calling yourself this bougie French name. They were intellectuals and they started to like take a non-MLM or a non-ML approach to.
They were aesthetic revolutionaries.
They were just like, hey man, any theory is good theory as long as we could apply it correctly.
Yep.
Yeah. That's the old
T-shirt
like,
revolutionary.
Yeah. So we'll just take everything. Not that you can't take lessons from revolutions that are proletarian, but like they're just like, so it was starting to creep in. And you know, the reason why there is this basis is because it doesn't matter, like even the party, like the Communist Party of the Philippines says, like there's always a two-line
DSA 1979.
Right? There's always a basis for opportunism or subjectivism in a party because there's always a two-line struggle in a party. There's always going to be a struggle between a proletarian line and a bourgeois line. And the proletarian parties that last for decades are the ones that could fight the bourgeois line and reassert the proletarian line. There's never going to be a perfect proletarian party. There's never going to be,
for sure.
You know, and so like people might be like, but they had this. I remember like, but they had like, I was asking older comrades who were like first quarter storm veterans. I was like, how did that happen? Like you guys had like a rectification movement and you're repeating all the mistakes, like military adventurism, you know, trying to win quickly or right-wing deviations. He's like, well, you know, and they explained it like, you know, listen, like these things happen because if we're not constantly, concretely applying our lessons every day, like this subjectivism can creep in because there's always a two-line struggle in any movement. It not even just a party. There's always like a two-line struggle between a revolutionary line that's proletarian and correct and a more bourgeois line. Just because, and the way she explained it was like, we live in a semi-feudal, semi-colonial, like decaying society. So of course we're going to have all the flaws of the society in our party. Right. So like,
yeah,
you know, so like this was really going around like Manila Rizal. And so they were actually questioning like, we don't think the Philippines is semi-feudal, semi-colonial. We think it's industrializing. So maybe we shouldn't have people's war. Maybe we should have urban insurrectionism. Now, if the Philippines was majority working class and most people were in the cities at the time, sure, you could have urban insurrectionism like guided by the party, but they weren't doing that because of the concrete conditions, they were just being Trotskyites and just being like, we'll just say whatever we can to justify what we want to do.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it started creeping into like some of the leadership in the Central Committee, according to like this summary. The party did a summary in 1990, like a 10-year summary. And like they were just like, yeah, this just stuff started creeping in. Like the leadership began to revise the protracted People's War strategy. They were influenced by Trotskyism, eclecticism. They wanted to focus on the urban centers as primary and not the peasants as primary, or not the countryside as a primary form of struggle for armed struggle. They wanted to, like
though the Philippines was drifting toward more peasants than
there was
working
definitely
class.
more people in Manila, but
Right.
there was just more people in general just because of
Sure.
regular population growth. But there were tons of peasants in Manila. Because they were part of the semi-proletariat, right?
Mhm.
So they weren't even inflating the working class or even industrializing. They were just there unemployed,
Right.
like having no jobs, scrounging. So even then you could maybe through a technicality be like, they're still a peasant. Like they're like,
Yeah.
they're not changing. It's just this horrible society being ravaged by Marcos's dictatorship and
Right.
plunder. And you remember there's neoliberalism going on worldwide. So that's affecting everybody. It was even affecting like the Soviet Union at the time,
Right.
where they're just like, I don't know, let's perestroika or whatever. Like eventually that's what happened. But
Yeah.
I know in the early 80s there were some forces in the Soviet Union trying to combat that, but I guess it didn't
lost.
work. They lost, unfortunately. There was even like so in a Politburo meeting in 1981, they introduced SCO, strategic counteroffensive. So they're just like, we don't need to do all these different stages of strategic defensive, strategic stalemate, strategic offensive. Like we don't need to do like a various substages and take our time and build up protracted People's War in the countryside, which had been very successful. So even by the mid 80s, the People's Army was very strong. The movement was very, very strong, right? But they were like, we're going to skip all that and just skip ahead to strategic stalemate and skip all the necessary steps. So instead of mass work and building up organs of political power in the countryside to support people's governments and to support like the People's Army, they're just like, we're just going to recruit as many people as we can, just get as many army people as we can. And then we're just going to have like people rise up in the cities. And they would shout like, bring the People's War home or whatever, like bring it to the cities.
Mhm.
Right. So then you had this like very partisan pull mill strategy. Then the central leadership started basing itself in the urban centers because, materially the urban centers are now the main form of struggle. So we need to be in the urban centers. So of course, like they're getting arrested because they're not in the countryside.
Mm.
Right. They started to decentralize their committees. So now all of a sudden, like there's no proper form of dem sen. So now regional committees and sectoral committees. So the sectoral committees of the Central Committee at the time that would do youth or students, the sectoral committee for workers, the class committee for workers, the sectoral committee for women, right? They were just kind of like on their own. So each committee kind of had its own different take.
Yeah.
And
it must be hard if you are part of a central committee to not be like, in the shit, basically, like, where everything is happening and in the
where
hottest
everything
zone.
was happening was the countryside, but then they shifted it to the city.
Because it seemed like more was going on there, right?
They were trying to make more going on there.
Okay.
They just wanted it to fit their line. And they basically abandoned protracted People's War. They abandoned MLM. They abandoned materialism. It was just like their own eclectic theories they wanted to put into practice that were incorrect. And so, then they based themselves in the cities. So like, materially shit's going on in the cities. Because there was tons of shit going on. Like it was crazy. And that was one of the mistakes is that they were mixing the legal movement and the underground movement and it just became blurred. So then you had unions and youth just talking about bringing People's War home and attacking the police and attacking like other like forms of the state structure. And then you had MPA units in there and no-go zones and people just like a random cop that wasn't really bothering anyone would just get randomly assassinated in the street. And then they would steal their weapons and they would rob banks. And then it was just like, there was bombs. Right. And then, so now all of a sudden the urban mass movement is in danger of being conflated with the mixing of the armed and the legal, and none of these practices are incorrect per se in that, of course, you do want some pole mill or political military strategy in the cities, but they totally shifted it away from the countryside, which is what they
Right.
should have been focused on.
And that's like, a lot of this sounds mildly, negative and critical of what's going on. But the whole point of this is you're trying to teach lessons, right? Like this is,
these are lessons that the movement has learned and has corrected
and has changed at this point.
So all these, so then like the Women's Bureau had a more bourgeois feminist line because they were kind of like on their own. And then the Youth and Student Bureau had this like super left, like kind of how we view maybe some like very hardcore revolutionary MLE students in the United States. Like it was centered on them. They're like, we're going to help bring it home instead of centered on the workers. Like your youth and students, but you center it on the workers. Like you fight for the rights in youth and students, but you also realize you're part of a proletarian revolution, right? And then the workers, like committees, were just like influenced by Poypoy Lagman, who was this like had these Trotskyite ideas, and he was just like Huelga ng Bayan, so nationwide strike. But like nationwide strike for what? Like you could have a nationwide strike to cripple the economy, but if you don't have a strong people's army, then nothing's going to happen, right? So we will still have Huelga ng Bayan, but we'll have like during the State of the Nation address to protest Duterte, we'll shut down like transportation strikes. Like 90% of Manila was shut down, and like 100% of Davao was shut down in the because of the Huelga ng Bayan. But that was just for a day to be like, hey, we have power. Yeah, you have to listen to the mass movement.
Sure.
Right. But back then they were trying to do it to take over the government, and it was an incorrect strategy. And so they basically forgot about the peasantry, and they were just focused on like the workers can do it all by themselves, and which is this very trot line, like we don't need anybody, like we don't need any United Front work, we don't need any class work, we'll just do it. And of course it like didn't work, shit started going down. So like 85, the party was still in the main correct, because even though the leadership was becoming opportunist and revisionist, most of the cadres were actually really good. And it takes a while for these plans to get implemented. So even by the mid 80s, all the correct implementation of People's War and workers' strikes and anti-fascist struggles were actually working, right? And so like they were able to build up a strong mass movement even by the mid 1980s. But leadership started getting arrested because they're based in the countryside, right? Strikes,
because they were based in the countryside?
I mean, because they were based in the cities.
Oh, okay.
There we go.
I was like, this. Everybody's just getting arrested everywhere.
So people are getting arrested left and right. Regions are implementing their own ideological lines because there's almost no connection now with the central leadership. But the central leadership was becoming revisionist anyway. So they just be like, I want to do this. They're like, whatever. And they're like, okay, cool. Like there was no like basic study of ideology that had been going on in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, right? So they became very loose in this grasp of work. And then when the leadership started failing, the People's Army, which was built up way too prematurely, was not being supported by a mass base in the countryside. And then they started losing soldiers, and they started losing fights, and they started losing clashes with the armed forces of the Philippines because they weren't doing guerrilla warfare anymore. They were trying to do like mobile warfare. They were trying to like do one-on-one, like brute force v brute force, because they're just like, we're in a new stage now, and like we're going to apply this new stage and meet the military.
It's a terrible
head on.
idea.
Yeah. So people like Romulo Quintanar, who was in the general command of the MPA, and the general command doesn't exist anymore in the party because it kind of did its own thing. And so the MPA was no longer being led by the party. It was leading the party. Like, the party, doesn't have the gun lead it or whatever, like, or the gun doesn't lead the party commands the gun, that Mao quote or whatever. So
that's
like,
how it should be. Yeah.
That's how it should be. And that's what was being practiced. And so Quintanar was like, oh, well, obviously we're losing because of deep penetration agents. We're losing because there's spies everywhere. It's not because I'm a shitty tactician. Right. So then he started Kampangyang Ahos. And that was an anti-DPA campaign that murdered hundreds of Communist Party members. And it violated DEMSEN. It violated the rights of party members. It didn't even follow People's Court procedures. They just tortured and killed party members, up to maybe 300 in Mindanao. So Quintanar is based in Mindanao. And when they had a Central Committee report in like 1986 or whatever, he didn't even report it to the Central Committee. He didn't. They're like, "What's going on in Mindanao?" He's like, "It's great," and they're like, "All right, moving on." And then, right? Because at the time, it seemed like on the surface it was great because the newspaper coverage was really good, and like it seemed like, oh, the New People's Army is big. They didn't know that it was an inflated number. Like in that they did have the numbers, but they couldn't sustain the numbers, right?
Yeah.
It would be like if all of a sudden like Colorado Springs had 1,000 people, Army members spring up in one night. And then all of a sudden they're like, wait, how do we feed ourselves? Where do we go? We don't have any safe houses. We don't have any ammunition. Oh no, we're screwed. And, and then, the police come and arrest everyone and kill people. And you're like, we know what happened. It was FBI infiltration. And like, no, if that analogy makes any sense whatsoever.
It does.
Right. Oh, thank you. Right. So, in the middle of this, Marcos is overthrown, partly due to the strength of the revolutionary movement weakening the system, but also due to the leadership of the petty bourgeoisie and mainly due to like the U.S. imperialism and the AFP no longer supporting Marcos anymore. Right. So if it wasn't for the Rev movement, he wouldn't have been overthrown. But because the Rev movement was kind of in chaos, like they couldn't take advantage of it. Right. There was elements in exile and also elements in various levels of leadership in the CPP at the time in the Philippines. Like around 1988, like they started to realize there's like something's off. Like this isn't working. Like there's something going on that we need to rectify. Like for 4 years, we've kind of been in chaos. It especially happened after a breakdown with peace talks with the Aquino government. So Cory Aquino, landlord of the Cojuangco family, was the president after Marcos, and her son ended up Noy Aquino ended up being president in 2010. Surprise, surprise, right? Of course, but they had peace talks, and the peace talks basically broke down because the AFP did not want them to work because the AFP are like the main enforcer for U.S. imperialism, and so Aquino declared a total war policy, very similar to Duterte's nationwide approach to like counterinsurgency, where everybody is a target. It doesn't matter if they're illegal or underground. It doesn't matter if they're just progressive and not even revolutionary. Like everything was on the table. So like the founding member of Bayan, Leon Alejandro, and Bayan is this legal national democratic political center to coordinate all sorts of, revolutionary activity through the labor unions and through the peasant organizations and the youth and student groups or whatever. He was assassinated in broad daylight. I believe his driver was killed. And then also during like that same year, the leader of Kilusan May Uno, which had just been founded just a few years before, Olalia, he was assassinated, right? And then so all of a sudden, like people were being assassinated in the legal movement left and right. And because of the errors, these ideological errors, like the MPA was breaking down, the party leadership was breaking down. So like there was a huge rebuke like in the leadership from the masses in the CPP at the time, where like there was a Politburo meeting in 1989, and they basically rebuked like the strategic counteroffensive. They found out about Campañang Ajos. They rebuked that. They like started to go like, we need a rectification movement. Like we had one 20 years ago. We need another one. Like this is not working because like they emphasize that the armed struggle needs to build up a mass base, right? Because armed struggle has three components. There's building a mass base, which is revolutionary organs of political power in the countryside. The second form of it is agrarian reform or agrarian revolutionary reform, where you're lowering land rent, you're collectivizing at some level,
right.
Like
establishing sustainability for a population.
Sustainability, collectivizing stuff for the peasantry, taking land that's not being used, negotiating with landlords, eliminating usury, and then of course building the New People's Army. And those are like the three components of armed struggle. So they're just like, you have to build a mass base. Like, and so they totally rejected the verticalization of building up the MPA. Like, we don't need to build squads and like have them do propaganda and build with the masses. We just need like companies and platoons, and like we're just going to verticalize it.
No.
So they started repudiating all of this stuff. And then so they started debates in the Central Committee and in the Politburo. And so there was like huge upheaval in the leadership. So like the people who were doing the mistakes started accusing the leadership of being dogmatic. They said, you're a bunch of Stalinists. You guys are violating democratic centralism. This has to be democratic. And they'd be like, yeah, this is democratic. We're having a debate and we're like repudiating your BS. right? And they basically, when they were in charge in the 80s and doing all these errors, they had these very commandist tendencies, people like Poipoy Lagman and Quintanar. And then by 1990, when the errors started getting repudiated, they're like, you can't repudiate us. We repudiate you and MLM and the party and all these concepts. So
Jesus.
like, yeah,
Whack.
right. So of course, you know, the proletarian party members were like, actually, this is good. This is good that this is happening because it's not a split. We're like expelling elements who were never proletarian to begin with. Right. And so like there was basically like,
Sounds familiar.
mhm. Yeah. Right. There was a 10th plenum called in 1990 for all the central committee to get together. And the last plenum was in 1985 at that point. And so what they did was they called for a reaffirmation of our basic principles of Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought. And they called it was the IDKP. So there was the UDKP, the first Great Rectification Movement. And in 92, they started the IDKP, the second Great Rectification Movement. That lasted up until 98. So like, I don't want to call it splits, like people left. So there was RAs and RJs. So there's the reaffirmists who reaffirmed the basic principles of proletarian leadership. And they're just like, yeah, the Soviet Union fell, but that was their fault. They were revisionists. And then the RJs were like, no, it's because communism doesn't work and the party is stupid. And they're like, what? Like, you know, so then there was people, and it really did split like the labor movement. So like all these battles of ideas that were going on in the party were also going on in the legal movement, in the youth and student movement, and especially with the workers, because many of the leadership in the Manila Rizal region that started having these eclectic non-Marxist ideas were like workers, right? And so they maybe split Kilosama Uno by like a third, and they created their own labor organizations that were mostly trot, right? So they kind of revealed themselves as being trots,
Real
you
cool.
know, yeah, right. So, but you know, now they're not as big as the movement now. Like 20 years later, we could see who was correct and who was incorrect. Cause it's like, well, you know, like the National Democratic organizers who adhered and reaffirmed the basic principles of Marxism, Leninism, right? And like the need to have protracted people's war and the need to have a analysis that the Philippines is semi-feudal, semi-colonial, like they've built up strength. Like by 1998, 1999, the strength of the MPA was built up. Even in the region that it was hurt the most, which was Mindanao, right? That's where the purges started to happen. Ka Roger, who was a spokesperson, a revolutionary spokesperson for the National Democratic Front, talked about at the time, whole MPA units just left. They're just like, I don't want to get caught up in this. I don't want to die. I don't want to do a adventurous raid and get killed, or I don't want to be accused of being a deep penetration agent by this insane person, Quintanar, you know, and they just left. And like many people stayed despite that. So like Ka Roger, who passed away in like 2011 or 2012, he stayed in the movement. And then so now the strongest mass base for armed struggle is in Mindanao, is in southern Mindanao region. And so that just goes to show you like these criticisms and these rectifications and these applications of Marxism, Leninism, and the ability to correct and not subsume themselves to revisionism works, because in a area where there was all this propaganda that the bourgeois uses, they're like, yeah, communists were killing millions of people. And they're like, no, like we were targeting ourselves and that was very wrong. But we didn't kill, like, and if they did, the masses wouldn't support the party today or the MPA, right? But they do, right? And so that was like a big lesson that the party applied, was like this second rectification movement, which, you know, like there was like some culling or some, I don't know how to call it, but like people leaving the party, or even people who weren't in the party just leaving the National Democratic Revolutionary Movement because they were just like, oh yeah, they're just being, you know, Stalinist, or they're just being like, communism doesn't work anymore, you know. And so it, but the reaffirmation of these principles really built up again the legal mass movement, and built up again the underground and the New People's Army, and reaffirmed all these basic principles. And so these were like just harsh lessons, but like it kind of showed the ideological moorings of many of the members of the party, that they were able to get through that. Right. And so like, there's still like lessons. Like I know the party recently had its second Congress in 2016, and they just updated their constitution. They didn't change anything. I think the only thing they changed was like you can retire now once you hit 70. Like, but they didn't change the political line to revise anything. So you could go online, cpp.ph, just download the Consti. It has the political program for anyone who's interested. But they started like their big thing they were talking about is to like rectify more conservatism and armed struggle, and to like rectify maybe some like sectarianism in the party. Like these are just in their statements recently where they're just like, it's not really a rectification movement. We're just like having like a mini rectification movement where like we swung so hard to left adventurism that like we became a little bit more too conservative in some regions. So regions like Mindanao, which like are meeting the army like head on, right? The armed forces of the Philippines and like fighting back and gaining victories. And in other regions like in Central Luzon, where there's these counterinsurgency operations, they kind of failed. And the party's like, well, that's probably because of conservatism. So we need to learn where we're working in Mindanao, fight these conservative tendencies, then fight these sectarian tendencies where like maybe our youth activists are just not concerned enough about like the peasants in the countryside, or they're too concerned about like, or they don't know how to like process the whole with their particularity, right? So like this particular unit doesn't know how to process like with other units like nationwide, or just view it like their own empirical experiences. They need to broaden them out more. But yeah, so like those were like big lessons, like these ideological lessons in like the first kind of two rectification movements. That kind of brings us to like now for the party, and like, you know, because most of the history like up to that point, like, you know, you had Aquino, you had Ramos, you had Estrada, who was overthrown again in another ETSA style revolution. You had Gloria Macapagal Arroyo. That's when I came in, like when she was president. Then after her, you had Aquino, and now we have like Duterte. So like, you know, the overall conditions have only gotten worse, right? So like the U.S. bases were outlawed in 92. Estrada was the key vote in the Senate. The Senate, I think, has 24 people, and he was like the 13th vote to vote out U.S. bases, because even in the middle of a rectification movement and all this stuff going on, the mass movement of the National Democratic Revolution, like the legal mass movement, was still super strong, and they basically forced the Senate to not uphold a treaty to allow U.S. bases in the Philippines. But then Estrada gets elected in 98 or 90, I think in 98, or 96 or whatever. And he then signs a visiting forces agreement, and which allows U.S. troops back into the Philippines. So again, he swung, like when he was in the Senate, he could be slightly more progressive. Estrada's this big action star. Like he's this big, like Charles Bronson, like action star from the 70s. Kind of like if Chuck Norris became president or something. Like, and then under the Aquino administration, they signed EDCA, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Act, where basically they're converting AFP bases into bases for the U.S. Army. So basically there's U.S. bases in the Philippines now. Duterte's even updated EDCA and updated like this one Air Force base in order to like allow more U.S. troops in there. Right. There's some Chinese troops I think are trying to get into Clark Air Base, and I think they are. So like Duterte's like, I don't care.
That'd be interesting.
Highest bidder. Right. Yeah. So so pretty much allowing foreign troops on their soil, which like the United States would never allow.
But for what benefit?
The benefit of propping up the semi-feudal, semi-colonial system. So like, and the benefit of the U.S. in that, like, they still control the Philippines and the strategic position that the Philippines is in Southeast Asia. So yeah, but there's been all that. There's been an uptick in the New People's Army. Like they currently are talking about how they're basically in the middle stage of the strategic defensive. Which we could talk about like at another time or whatever. And they're trying to get to the advanced stage of a strategic defensive. So there's been like advancements in the armed struggle, advancements in the mass movement, especially in trying to isolate Duterte, and teaming up with like other like bourgeois parties to like, because you want to isolate the narrowest target, because the narrowest target usually represents the most fascist and pro-US centric tendencies in the Philippines. And that's typically always the president. And right now that guy is Duterte. Right. And so like he's doing this total war policy similar to Aquino, where he's just targeting people like left and right. But pretty much like the history, like which we covered up to the 70s in our Marcos, it's pretty much the same. More neoliberalism, more semi-feudal, semi-colonial decay, like in the Philippines.
From your perspective, what do you think they're looking at for the future? Like what possible options are there?
In terms of the revolutionary movement or possible options? I mean, everything's on the table. Pretty much, we engaged with peace talks with we've been engaging in peace talks since 1986, right? So in 92, the Ramos government, they signed peace talks with the NDF and the Communist Party of the Philippines. So the NDF is this consolidated underground revolutionary alliance of all these revolutionary organizations. There's like the revolutionary organizations of AITA. There's the Revolutionary Council of Trade Unions, which are revolutionary trade union activists and trade unions who basically coordinate and cooperate with the Communist Party. And they like support armed struggle. So hence, underground. Then there's like, then there's PKM, which is like the Revolutionary Organization of Peasants. And that's probably maybe one of the largest mass organizations in the Philippines, even larger than the legal mass organizations, just because the countryside is so revolutionary that it makes sense that this Revolutionary Peasant Org is the largest. But the NDF, through the organs of democratic and political power, has been empowered by the people's government in the countryside to negotiate on its behalf. So the NPA isn't negotiating with the government, and the Communist Party of the Philippines isn't negotiating with the government. It's the NDF representing the revolutionary government in the countryside negotiating, and Norway is the mediator. And Norway's been the mediator since the 90s.
Huh, that's kind of random.
Yeah. So like the peace talks are done overseas because the lesson from the peace talks with Aquino was that they were spying on us. So that's overseas. But one of the first agreements was JSIG, the Joint Agreement on Security and Immunity Guarantees. And it was for NDF representatives who, some of them were Communist Party members, some of them weren't. And they were given immunity to not be harassed, not be arrested, and technically to not be surveilled. And they do that so they could go from revolutionary base area to revolutionary base area, and even to the legal. Like they'll have talks with like the legal mass organizations of youth, or they'll have talks with like trade union people, and they want to know, what do you want us to do in the peace talks? Like, how do we represent the people in the peace talks? Because we know the government's doing it with the bourgeois. So like, we're going to do it with the people. So like they signed that. They signed the comprehensive agreement, Carril. They signed the comprehensive agreement on human rights and international law, which holds the New People's Army and the Armed Forces of the Philippines, the reactionary government, to all international protocols for the rules of war. So hence why, like, the New People's Army doesn't use landmines. They use remote controlled detonated devices because that's illegal. Now, does the Philippine Army adhere to this? No. They're kidnapping people left and right. They're assassinating people. They've assassinated lawyers. This one lawyer was protected by JSIG. He was in the NDF, and he was shot 6 times on a bus. My friend Brandon Lee, who I grew up with, was we grew up in the same city together, in the same neighborhood, went to the same YMCA and rec and park programs, moved to the Philippines 10 years ago, had a wife and kids, lived in the Cordilleras, and he was worked for Nordis, which was Northern Dispatch, which is a progressive newspaper, which I talked about earlier. And he was also a paralegal and he fought for the rights of peasants and the indigenous people. And Mayumi, who was the leader of the organization, he was a part of the Ifugao, I think the Ifugao peasant movement, or it could be the Ifugao like human rights organization. And he was assassinated by the AFP, by the Armed Forces of the Philippines. And then he got shot like 4 to 7 times. Brandon was shot by a military intel agent outside his home after he picked up his daughter from school, and after he fed his dog. And so I got like a text at like 8 a.m. when I was at work from one of my comrades in Manila saying like, "Oh, did you hear about Brandon?" And I immediately thought he was dead. And then he just told me the updates. And it's a miracle that he survived. So like right now we're trying to raise 200 G's because it's a lot of money. We've already spent like $50,000 like in terms of medical costs and like medical transportation from Baguio to Quezon City to St. Luke's to now a public hospital in California. So hopefully you guys, could also help spread the word on Proles Pod and Discord and whatever. But that's kind of like what's going on right now. So this was post peace talks with Duterte. So we had agreements with Ramos, and like our movement has had agreements with Estrada, and they signed them both, and they're supposed to respect them. And then the peace talks with Duterte, because he's like, I'm a socialist, I hate America. We're like, okay. And then like maybe, but the AFP is there, so they're going to make sure you love America. And so now he loves America. And he probably always has. He's always had these fascist tendencies.
He's like Trotsky with his like different points all over the political compass, just like left, right, up, down, doesn't matter.
Yeah. So like the peace talks were about comprehensive agrarian reform, or comprehensive agrarian and social economic reforms, CASER. So like through these talks with the revolutionary governments in the various parts of the country side, some of them like right outside Manila, some of them like literally right outside Davao, which are two major cities.
Sure.
They came up with like, basically like we want to industrialize the Philippines. We want jobs for Filipinos. We want to stop the labor export policy. We want agrarian reform. We want land to the tiller without compensation, right? All these stuff. And the government's like, how about you give up arms? And then like, the negotiators were like, we already agreed to a timetable. And the timetable was human rights, your immunities, which we signed, human rights, which we signed. Now we're going to negotiate comprehensive agrarian reform and social and economic reforms. And then like the next step after that, I think might be negotiations on foreign relations. Then once that's signed, then we'll negotiate arms.
Right.
Which just basically means like, like what China did, which is like, don't get rid of the People's Army. Like they just become a national army. Right. Unlike what like FARC did, unfortunately, but they're like backtracking now because they realized it was a mistake to give up their arms. Or in Nepal, they like immediately gave up their arms and tried to integrate into the Royal Army, and that didn't work. And that's caused all sorts of contradictions and stuff. But like, so the Duterte administration was like, no, you have to give up arms because you have revolutionary taxes and that's wrong. And they're just like, that's not like, that's what you need. Like revolutionary taxes to support the revolutionary people's government. Like, no, you have to get rid of that. They're like, what do you want us to get rid of that or the arms? And they're like, get rid of it. We're like, well, you can't negotiate that way. So then after that, it just total swing to the fascist side of the AFP, which was just this comprehensive total war policy, this counterinsurgency policy that not only targets the MPA and not only the communities in the revolutionary areas, but like schools. So like there's these indigenous schools in southern Mindanao of the Lumad indigenous people who are some of the strongest supporters of the National Democratic Revolution because it meets their needs, right? Obviously, national autonomy for indigenous peoples, indigenous rights, education. And they built these schools, these like indigenous folks and these legal organizers, like they built these schools that were actually part of the like Philippine education system and were actually certified by the Philippine education system. And then Duterte said like, I'm going to bomb the schools, right? I'm going to bomb the schools. And then they shut them down. And now these Lumad kids who are refugees because their communities are being bombed because of this total war policy by the Aquino administration, they have nowhere to go. They have nowhere to learn. And they were just like, oh, they're learning about their history. Like the history we went over, like the colonial history of Spain and the US, they were learning.
Yeah.
Right. But they were also certified by the Department of Education. Right. And so then there's human rights activists like my friend Brandon who are being assassinated and lawyers who are being assassinated. And so it's not just like the military occupation of the countryside. There's also martial law
Sure.
in 1/3 of the Philippines, which is in Mindanao. And now there's martial law, de facto martial law in Negros, and dozens of people in the past month have been assassinated. And then the government's like, it must be the MPA that's doing it, and then, but also the MPA is weakening. Oh, they're giving up left and right. So then now they're parading people who are just abducted peasants, right? And they're parading them into the cameras. And some of them are actual AFP soldiers. So one of them would 2 weeks ago, was paraded in front of the cameras, like he gave up, because when you give up, there's a bounty. And so what the bounty system is like millions of pesos the AFP is funneling to itself. They're like, well, we technically caught him, so we get the bounty, right? Right.
But
I know. So but it turns out that guy they paraded on camera was a soldier. They're like that guy looks familiar. And then some journalist did some digging and he's on Facebook in his AFP uniform.
Jesus.
Right. So they're not giving up.
Incredible.
The New People's Army aren't giving up, and the people aren't giving up, And then there was a human rights organizer, a young woman, Alexandria, who was kidnapped a week ago by the military and tortured and forced to sign a confession that I surrender, I'm surrendering, I'm in the MPA. She couldn't sleep for 3 days. She was being just all sorts of forms of torture. So of course, you sign anything. So they went to. So right now they're now legally using the legal system to try to target legal National Democratic organizations. So now Senator Bato, who's a fascist, who was part of this fascist murder squad in the 1980s that cut people's heads off and did all sorts of crazy stuff when Duterte was the mayor of Davao. And Duterte and other people are saying that Anak Bayan, which is a nationwide National Democratic mass organization, legal organization of youth, is kidnapping children and sending them to the MPA. And then so there's this one mother who went to the Senate and was like, my daughter was kidnapped and she was sent to the MPA. And then her daughter went on Facebook, is like, I was not kidnapped. I'm like 17, I wouldn't even be able to join the MPA. And also I'm here. I'm like, I left you because you're really nuts.
Yeah.
And you're treating me really bad. So I want to serve the people, but I'm here. I'm like, whatever. They're like, no, she's kidnapped. Right. So now they're trying to say that Alexandria, she was a youth member who was brainwashed and now she gave herself up. But then her family's and they try to use her family. They try to tell her mom and dad, oh, you should go on TV and say your daughter was kidnapped by Anak Bayan and was forced to join the MPA and she gave herself up. And they're like, no, that is not true.
Yeah.
And our daughter is now filed, they've counterfiled and basically said she's been kidnapped by the AFP and she was forced through torture to say she was in the MPA, but she wasn't. And this is going on all over the place. Constantly. Yeah. So that's the current situation. So what's going to happen is it's only going to strengthen not just the legal mass movement, but the underground, because people are going to be like, well, I don't want to get tortured, so maybe I'll just join the MPA.
Right.
Right. And the party and the MPA is saying we're getting more people than ever joining the revolutionary underground because the conditions here are really bad and the contradictions are heightening. So really probably what's going to happen is just build up strength in the countryside while Duterte continues to isolate himself, even from other landlords and even from other bourgeois folks and parties. He's already attacked his vice president and is trying to arrest her, right? Because she's in the Liberal Party, right? So because she's in the Liberal Party and doesn't support Duterte, he's trying to arrest her. So then now there's this real broad front to oust Duterte. So if he gets ousted or if he declares martial law nationwide and extends his term illegally, there's just a lot of possibilities for the movement in the above ground and the underground to do a lot of work to broaden the National Democratic reach and perspective to the people in society and Filipinos overseas, and to isolate Duterte even further and even kick him out, and take advantage of those splits among the reactionaries to strengthen even the revolutionary movement. But the party, if you just read their statements, they're really talking about needing to kind of get to a point where there's a strategic stalemate, and then we'll see the tipping point in the legal mass movement. If we're strong enough, and the armed struggle is strong enough, they could eventually overthrow the entire system, brace for I don't know, U.S. imperialism to invade. Hopefully
Right.
it doesn't.
Yeah.
And then to immediately implement socialism. So like there's like these long term and short term. They're all kind of like mixed
Right.
together. I don't know.
And that's probably going to depend heavily on what the U.S. involves itself in the next several years. So
Yeah.
if it gets itself involved in too many wars, then it may not be able to then jump into the Philippines. But or maybe they will, and then it'll just collapse.
Yeah.
Because
Be the
stretched
death-
too thin.
Yeah, maybe the
Yeah.
Philippines will be the death knell of U.S.
Maybe.
imperialism.
Jesus.
One could only hope.
Death to America.
It's very possible that any war that the U.S. gets involved in now could kind of cement the downfall of it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
uh,
why they're trying to basically negotiate with the Taliban to get the hell out of Afghanistan
Right.
because they're
Mhm.
just overextending.
Right. They
Yeah.
can't get involved in Iran and in Syria because they have too many resources in Iraq and Afghanistan. And if they can get out of those two or one of the two, then they can at least redirect those resources to
And
crush
there's
other places.
there's no questioning even on the right that they are, wars to cement profits
Mhm.
anymore.
Sure.
Yeah.
Like there's nobody believes that they're fighting legitimately.
For freedom.
Yeah, exactly. They'll use the rhetoric, but they won't.
Yeah,
Anytime they
it's
sit
just
down
a
and think
cover.
about it, they're like, oh, wow, well,
Well,
this war is actually really fucked up.
yeah.
So then, when Americans who have been deployed to Iran and Iraq and Afghanistan, or Iraq and Afghanistan, get deployed to, or have their kids deployed to Iran,
Right.
then it's like, well, fuck, my kids are going to end up with all of the struggles that I had, and that could be a point of radicalization.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this will be the year in which children who were not born when the war on terror began are now being shipped off to the desert to
Yeah.
fight in this war on terror. It's been going on since before they were born, which is incredible. But yeah, any sort of final thoughts, Daniel?
Yeah, so directly, there's this alliance called the Bagong Alyansang Makabayan. Hit the mic, or Bayan, the New Patriotic Alliance, right? And it's a legal political center that coordinates all the National Democratic activity in the legal movement. So you have Gabriela, which is the legal mass organization for women that fights for the rights and welfare and the advancement of women in this super feudal society, right? Which U.S. imperialism and feudalism upholds the oppression of women. And so then Gabriela is very much fighting the semi-feudal, semi-colonial system as their primary form of struggle.
Cool.
They're a part of that alliance. You have the Cordillera People's Alliance, which is this alliance of organizations of the Igorot, or the Cordillera indigenous folks, where my friend Brandon was based for many years. They're part of this alliance. Then you have Kilusan May Uno, which is the trade labor center, which NAFLU, which I talked about earlier, is a part of. And then you have, what do you have? KMP, Kilusan Magbubukid ng Pilipinas, which is the legal peasant alliance. So there is an underground peasant movement. There's also a legal above ground peasant movement that does a lot of work, legal struggles and other stuff to help support peasants, lobby for better land reform laws and whatever. And they're all part of Bayan, right? And Bayan has reach overseas because the Philippines, being a semi-feudal, semi-colonial country, there's millions and millions of Filipinos who leave the country every day because of labor export policy, because the government literally has programs to ship people out of the country so they can send remittances back so they could tax that to try to short-term alleviate the unemployment issues of the petty bourgeoisie and the working class. So they go to Hong Kong, where they are treated like shit by the bourgeois in Hong Kong, and they go to Saudi Arabia, where they're treated like shit by the Saudi royals, and they build their projects. And they even come to the United States. So there's this organization called Migrante International, which is a national democratic workers' rights and welfare association, which I also organize with. And then so directly, you guys, we could all be in contact with the National Democratic organizers in the United States through Bayan. There's Bayan USA. And so it's they coordinate activity between all the 24 or more various National Democratic mass organizations in the United States. And because there's a Bayan USA, there's a direct connection to the movement, the National Democratic Movement in the Philippines. Also, like one way to support is really Bayan USA and Migrante, and even in the Philippines, the Cordillera People's Alliance really are pushing a fundraise for Brandon Lee. And then that also brings awareness to the other human rights violations that the Duterte administration is going. So like right now we have a GoFundMe page. We had two. The first one, we succeeded. We raised the money we needed for his initial transportation to Manila and his initial recovery and operations in Baguio. And now we need to raise all this money in order to airlift him back. He does not want to go back to the United States, but the National Union of People's Lawyers and Human Rights Organization Karapatan, which are both National Democratic with a socialist perspective. So they're also part of the movement as well. And in that history, and they're just like, you're in danger here.
Right.
And like, we know you love the Philippines and the Filipino people, but like your wife wants you to go, and like she's going to meet you there in the United States, and your mom and your brother who are here right now, who grew up like in your neighborhood, like they want you to go back. So like,
Sure.
So he's like, okay, like, I guess it was a collective decision. So, but he can only communicate like very like through writing and whatever. And, and me and him, like we were youth organizers back in the day. And so like, I'm on this thread. There's like maybe 10 of us on this thread, and like we get all this updates on Brandon, and we're able to like FaceTime with him with a little bit, which was nice. But I would say, yeah, like getting involved with like Migrante or Bayan. The closest stuff to you guys here, I guess, would be Chicago. I don't know. I mean, we could talk maybe more about that, and that could be in the show notes. But definitely like supporting the legal mass movement for national democracy in the Philippines is the best like material way. And like, again, like I said, I think this was off podcast, but like, if you guys ever want to like integrate with like the peasant movement in the countryside or the workers movement in the cities, or you just want to see how like workers and peasants do media or podcasts, or like how they organize like cultural work or whatever, because that's like one of the most important things in the Philippines is this cultural work to propagate like mass base like pro people culture against the dominant feudal Catholic and US impe culture that people are barraged with every day. So yeah, I would say like, directly supporting national democratic organizers in the United States who are fighting for the rights and welfare of Filipino and Filipino Americans, but directly related to the conditions in the Philippines, because that's why people are here. Right. And then so that in a very material way will support the like national democratic movement in the Philippines, which will then, once they succeed and win, like that'll be a huge contribution even to the work in the US, because then it'll just destabilize the US ruling class, So
one pillar at a time.
One pillar at a time. Right. Yeah.
Primary contradictions first.
Yeah. So anyway, but I'll give you like resources.
Yeah,
for
we
sure.
can put additional stuff in the show notes that you didn't talk about.
Yeah, because there's like news
party program and whatnot.
Yeah, there's like news organizations, there's YouTube channels, like even like the NPA, the New People's Army, has its own like Instagram account.
Nice.
And they're like, this is our lunch today. You're like, oh, fish, cool. Like,
nice.
But yeah, I'll share all that stuff as well, and like the GoFundMe link and stuff. So
cool.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming on, Daniel.
Oh yeah, thank you for having me.
Of course. All right, and we are back. This is, again, kind of an unusual episode. We broke it into kind of two sections, and the first portion with Daniel we recorded last week, and we now have on the phone with us Professor Sarah Raimundo. So I guess, Sarah, do you want to introduce yourself and tell the listeners a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thank you. I'm happy to be with the Proles of the Roundtable. I'm Sarah. I work for the Bayan, Bagong Alyansang Makabayan, or the New Patriotic Alliance. I'm with its International Solidarity Committee, as I also teach at the Center of International Studies of the State University here in the Philippines.
Nice. Yeah. So Daniel kind of gave us a context of sort of the history of the Philippines, and particularly the communist struggle there. But I suppose you're kind of on the ground right now, and what is the current context of that struggle, and I suppose what's happening right now?
Okay, great. The New Patriotic Alliance is a broad movement, basically an urban mass movement composed of different sectors, led by the basic sectors. This is the Worker Peasant Alliance. Of course, we are working with teachers, students, church people, and special sectors like the urban poor, women, and so on and so forth. And right now, since 2017, we began with our campaign for the peace talks to actually trace the roots of counterinsurgency here in the Philippines. So once Duterte came to power in 2016, the National Democratic Movement campaigned for peace talks, for peace negotiations. And so that was the first campaign of Bayan. And then since Duterte's embrace of the global imperialist right-wing war against the people, which also began around that time with his war on drugs and escalated since 2017 up to the present, the New Patriotic Alliance, with all of its organizations, its member organizations, have been one of the active organization or alliance in pushing the movement against tyranny here in the country. So back in, recently, just back in September, we had a commemoration of the Martial Law Declaration in 1972. The Marcoses are back, and they've been rehabilitated politically by the Duterte administration. And right now, we are campaigning against grave threats, the different counterinsurgency programs targeting legal activists. So so basically, it's our campaign for human rights, our campaign against tyranny, and we also joined the climate strike, but focusing on imperialist plunder and tyranny, to actually which actually shapes our experience of climate crises here in the Philippines.
Nice. Is there anything anywhere people can kind of follow what's going on in the Philippines that you would recommend as like a source of information or news or that, isn't going to be imperialist propaganda or anything like that?
Yes, we do have a website. It's Bayan. I will send it to you. I will send the link to you.
Okay.
And one of our members, the National Alliance of Human Rights, it's called Karapatan, which means rights, also has a website, and it comes out with an update, Karapatan update almost every day. So you can read all of our updates and our campaigns on that website, Karapatan.
Okay. And I suppose is that going to be mostly related to within the urban centers, or is this also going to include kind of rural like peasant organizations as well?
It covers all human rights violations in the urban centers as well as in the rural areas, especially now that the focus of our campaign is the counterinsurgency program being inflicted upon the people of Negros and Mindanao. These are they're part of the two major islands. We have three major islands in the Philippines: Luzon, Visayas, Mindanao. We are in Luzon, Manila, National Capital Region. Mindanao is a huge island, and since Duterte declared martial law of Mindanao in May 2017, and then we also have the Visayas. It's a coastal island, and right now, one of the provinces there, Negros Island, has been the target of severe repression, and farmers are being massacred. Their lawyers also they're being harassed, and one of the lawyers, Ben Ramos, was assassinated back in November. Wow. So so we also cover, or we have actually prioritized those two areas in terms of our campaign.
And you also write for Bayan, is that correct?
Well, I work for Bayan.
Okay.
Yeah, I write for another independent media outfit that is bulatlat.com, which also covers a lot of good stuff about what activists here in the Philippines are doing about the rising tyranny. So that's also a good source of news and analysis, bulatlat.com.
Yeah, I mean, if you're able to send us those links, we can put them in the show notes, and that way our listeners are able to kind of tap into all of those different options. Is there anything specifically you would want us to know, or the listeners to know?
Yes. I would like to, since we're currently trying to really campaign or launch an international campaign for what's happening in Negros. So I'd like to maybe talk about Negros killings.
Sure,
Which is part and parcel of a highly coordinated and quote unquote legitimate operations undertaken by the combined force of the military, paramilitary, and police. So this spate of killings in Negros has alarmed and enraged citizens across various sectors and regions. We believe that it is the result of the Duterte regime's implementation of a counterinsurgency campaign. Just to let you know more about Negros, it is an island known as a region of extremes. On the one hand, you have extreme wealth of big landlords and extreme poverty and hunger suffered by small peasants and agricultural workers. So the struggle for land of the landless peasants is historical, but also while they struggle for land, they're also pushing for social justice. So it's not just ownership of land. And the majority of the victims are peasants, and it proves that Duterte's counterinsurgency campaign is actually a tool to maintain landlessness for the tillers and the accumulation of wealth for the comprador and the local landed elite. In October 2018, one of the events that shocked us, which took place in Negros, is the Sagay massacre. It's actually the state's response to a growing resistance across the regions among landless farmers. So these landless farmers launched a campaign. It's called Bungkalan. It's a collective project of occupying idle lands to ensure food security, food sovereignty, sustainability through organic farming and other modes of scientific agriculture. So on account of this collective action, it's actually the farmers in Negros sees this as a breakthrough. And it was met with a series of state-sponsored attacks. And these state-sponsored attacks are made legitimate by different memos coming out of the palace. For example, the 2019 Memorandum Order 32, or MO 32, deploys both the armed forces of the Philippines and the Philippine National Police in the Visayas region. And according to this memo, the goal is, or the objective is to suppress lawless violence and acts of terror in certain areas. And then this was followed by the Executive Order 70, and it was created under the National Task Force to end local communist armed conflict. So you have the Duterte regime has this counterinsurgency program, but to actually, it claims that its main goal is to crush the communist insurgency. So they're targeting the New People's Army, But the ones who are really the ones who are affected and basically murdered, massacred, and killed are farmers who are part of the legal mass movement. So the implementation of the Memorandum Order 32 or MO 32 in the Negros Island has taken the form of the synchronized enhanced managing of police operations, and this has been what famous here they call it SEMPO, synchronized enhanced managing of police operations, and it is also known as Oplan Sauron. The mass killings and arrests of Negrense peasants and other sectors are being carried out as law enforcement through Oplan Sauron. So Sauron uses search warrants for loose firearms to legitimize police and military attacks in rural communities and households suspected as basis of support of the New People's Army or the NPA. For example, in July 23 to 17, that period, there were 18 people killed, and among them, a lawyer, a former mayor, a councilor, a former public school principal, a Department of Education official, a barangay captain, and several peasant leaders. Most victims were targets of political vilification through red tagging prior to their murder. So there's actually a pattern to this mad killings of people in Negros. So in response to this, the peasant movement here in the Philippines, in alliance with Bayan, has formed the Defend Negros, Stop the Attacks network. It began as a solidarity alliance or network of Negrenses, meaning people from Negros. But now it has grown to include advocates of human rights and genuine agrarian reform here in the Philippines. And we've held several forum discussions. And back in August, we held an International Day of Mourning for Negros, to which many organizations, allied organizations in different parts of the world, especially the ones that are part of the transnational movement in Bayan in the United States, in New Zealand, in Canada, in London, in the Netherlands, in Hong Kong, in Germany, and so on and so forth. They were part of this International Day of Mourning, which took place, it was August 20, but the different activities were held for 7 days, dedicated to raising consciousness and awareness and support for the people of Negros and their, of course, their families of the victims.
Sure. And I mean, it just sounds like, much like a lot of right-wing governments whenever there is any kind of threat to the bourgeois order, they tend to say, oh, it's all the communists and they're terrorists. And then, it doesn't matter whether you are a communist or a terrorist, you're going to get arrested or killed or whatever. It's, somewhat similar to what happened in Indonesia in the 60s when
exactly
it was just mass killing of Chinese immigrants or nationals who lived in Indonesia under the auspices of being, stamping out communism or whatever. So
exactly. Actually earlier this year, Duterte announced that he is studying the Indonesian model, and he would want to actually embrace that to manage the insurgency that goes on in the Philippines.
Ouch.
Yeah, it's something that he really announced publicly.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah. He's not very shy about, or clandestine about what he's doing. He's very open about it.
Not at all. Actually, back in August, he was very proud to have invited at least, I think, 15 members of the Israeli Defense Force. And they actually trained our own soldiers. And Duterte announced that he's planning to buy weapons from Israel, and he sees that as a wonderful development in terms of strengthening and reinforcing our own army, but only against our people. So that
Yikes.
Really is quite alarming. Yeah.
Right. Is there anywhere that, like, if people wanted to follow you or kind of keep updates on you as an individual, is there a place people can do that? Social media or anything?
I keep a column at bulatlat.com. It's called
Okay.
it's Blood Rush. I do have a Facebook account also using my real name, Sarah Raimundo. I have a Twitter account, but I'm not so much into
Not on it so
Twitter.
much.
Yeah,
No,
not so much.
Me
Yeah.
either. No.
Yeah.
It's a dark place.
It is a dark place.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mhm.
Okay. All right. Well, I suppose any final thoughts before we
Oh, yeah. Well, first, I'd like to thank Proles of the Roundtable. I listen to your show a lot, and I'm so
thank you.
glad that you have given us this opportunity to, talk about what's going on here in this part of the global South. It's really very important for us. I think connections such as this one is important to counter the U.S. Duterte partnership in terms of counterterrorism. I failed to mention that just in August 16, the Duterte regime and the United States Embassy actually signed an agreement to build a counterterrorism center to be funded by the U.S. State Department and built on Philippine soil. So this was a
Of course.
memorandum of understanding with an initial funding of $10 million from Donald Trump. So
Jesus.
I think yes,
Wow.
it's and that was just for the year. So we really think that the attacks on human rights is going to build up for the coming years, so long as Duterte is there. So it's really important for us to build international solidarity with people like you and with other organizations. And through your podcast, we really hope to reach out to good people around the world. And thank you so much.
Of course.
Oh, yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And
This
if there's some kind of development that you feel like needs to be heard, reach out to us and we'll make sure that
send
We
us
do
an email
another,
and we'll share it on our social media and talk about it if necessary on the podcast. So
Yes, thank you so much.
of course, thank you, Sarah. I hope you have a good rest of your day. I know you have field work to go to, so
Right.
we
Yeah.
won't keep you anymore. But,
Yes.
All right.
all right, solidarity.
So we wanted to thank both Sarah and Daniel for coming on tonight. And thank you so much to everyone for listening. Some suggested reading will be in the show notes. Our sponsors are all of our excellent fans on Patreon. As always, we have way too many to read each time now. But since the last time we recorded, these are the new ones, and there are a lot. Alexander, Alexandra, Bradford, Christopher, Cole, David, Davos, Ethan RC, Jean, Joe, Joseph, Kimmo, Matthew, Poundland Linen, Raul, Remains, Sankara was right, Steelfish,
Was.
Taylor, Uranus is the greatest planet in the solar system,
God damn it. Y'all are
Wesley,
monsters.
Wesley, William, Zach, and different spelled Zach. All of these people are inspiring and revolutionary and make it easier for us to make this podcast for you and have it sound good. We've established what we're calling the USSP with several child podcasts, and we've started centralizing links to the various feeds on our website. Check it out. Also, we wanted to thank Ransom Notes for our intro music. Check him out on SoundCloud. Please don't forget to rate and review. Visit prolespod.com. Like us on facebook.com@prolespod and follow us on Twitter @prolespod. If you have any feedback, topic ideas, or suggestions, feel free to send us an email at prolespod@gmail.com or in the comment box on our website, especially if you drunkenly want to rant at us about us being dinguists. We love that. Yeah. Thanks for tuning in. Solidarity forever.
Solidarity.
Kaslaap kumaken ka udanum hanapiksa tagayo sa kagpababa ingana waya waya uway taem kadi kadwa